There is a place on the western coast of France where the concrete never crumbled, where the walls built for war still stand, decades after the last sailor walked out through the gates, where the ceilings are so thick, so massive, so deliberately engineered to survive the worst that human beings could throw at them, that even now, even after everything, they remain exactly as they were left. Not ruins, not rubble, just walls, just concrete, just silence, where engines once roared and torpedoes were loaded in the grey Atlantic dawn. Saint-Nazaire, a port town at the mouth of the Loire River, where the river finally surrenders itself to the sea. Before the war, it was a place of ships and tides and working people, a town that smelled of salt and iron, and the particular honest exhaustion that comes from building things with your hands. The kind of place that rarely appears in history books. The kind of place that most of the world had never heard of, and likely never would have. Then Germany came, and in the years that followed, this modest French port would become one of the most strategically vital pieces of real estate on the entire planet. It would become the home base for a fleet of steel predators that prowled the Atlantic Ocean and nearly severed Britain's lifeline to the rest of the world. It would be bombed hundreds of times and never broken. It would be raided by some of the bravest men in British military history, men who sailed a burning destroyer straight into a fortified dock gate and changed the course of naval warfare with a single act of pure, controlled audacity. It would be surrounded, cut off, and besieged, and still it would not fall. Saint-Nazaire would hold out until the very end, not because its garrison were supermen, not because the concrete was magic, but because geography and engineering and the cold logic of military occupation had conspired to make this one small corner of occupied France into something genuinely, almost impossibly, difficult to destroy. This is the story of that place. It is a story about submarines, long, cylindrical machines of extraordinary technical sophistication that slipped beneath the surface of the Atlantic and hunted in coordinated packs, targeting the merchant convoys that kept Britain alive and the Allied war effort breathing. At their peak, operating out of Saint-Nazaire and the other great Atlantic U-boat bases, these vessels came closer to winning the war for Nazi Germany than almost any other weapon in the German arsenal, closer, perhaps, than most people today fully appreciate. But it is also a story about concrete, about what happens when an industrial nation with unlimited access to slave labor and engineering expertise decides to make something permanent. The bunkers that were built at Saint-Nazaire between 1940 and 1942 were not simply large buildings. They were statements of intent, structures designed not just to shelter submarines, but to render the entire might of the Allied air forces effectively useless, to make bombing irrelevant, to declare, in reinforced concrete several meters thick, that this base would function regardless of what the RAF could throw at it from the sky. For years, that declaration held true. And it is a story about people, about the French men and women who lived inside an occupied town, who watched German sailors walk their streets and German engineers reshape their waterfront, and who made choices, sometimes desperate, sometimes heroic, sometimes simply human, about how to survive. About the British commandos who trained for months to execute a raid so dangerous that the planners themselves calculated the odds of return as somewhere close to negligible. About the U-boat crews who set out from this port into some of the most brutal naval conditions imaginable. Young men in their 20s operating machines that were, in the wrong circumstances, simply sealed metal coffins. About the Allied aircrew who flew mission after mission against targets that seemed to absorb bombs without flinching. wondering whether anything they did was making the slightest difference. All of their stories converge here, at this mouth of a river, at these walls. What makes Saint Nazaire different from other Second World War sites? What makes it genuinely worth spending time with, worth understanding fully, is the way it demonstrates something fundamental about the nature of that conflict. The Second World War was not simply won by courage, though there was extraordinary courage on every side. It was not simply won by numbers, though numbers eventually mattered enormously. It was won by the interaction between technology and geography and strategy and human ingenuity, playing out across years and across oceans, with the outcome never entirely certain until very near the end. Saint-Nazaire is a place where you can watch all of those forces at work simultaneously, where you can trace the precise moment when German naval power reached its absolute zenith, and then follow the long, grinding, brutal process by which that power was reduced, through Allied technological innovation, through sacrifice at sea, through the patient accumulation of tactical advantage, until even the most formidable bunker on the Atlantic coast meant nothing at all. The concrete never crumbled, but the war was lost anyway. That tension between physical permanence and strategic failure, between military engineering and human reality, is at the heart of everything this documentary explores. Over the chapters ahead, we are going to walk through the complete history of this place, from the geography that made it inevitable, through the occupation that transformed it, through the construction that fortified it, through the operations that defined it, through the raids and bombing campaigns and resistance actions that tested it, all the way to the final months of isolation and the surrender that ended it. We will not rush. This story deserves the time it takes to tell properly. There are details here that matter, about how U-boat warfare actually functioned, about what it took to build these structures, about what the commando raid truly achieved and truly cost, about how the strategic balance shifted and why, and we are going to give all of them the attention they deserve. If you are watching this for the first time, welcome. Find somewhere comfortable. The story ahead is a long one, and deliberately so. This is the kind of history that rewards patience, that reveals something new with every layer you go deeper. If you have been following this channel for a while, you already know what to expect. You know that we take history seriously here, that we treat the people involved, on every side, as human beings rather than symbols, that we are more interested in understanding than in glorifying. If that is what brought you here, then please, if you have not already, subscribe and stay. There is a great deal more to come beyond this documentary, and we want you there for all of it. And if you are watching this as the night draws in, as you settle in for the long form, good. This is exactly the kind of story that is meant to unfold slowly, that is meant to carry you somewhere else for a while. Let it. The Loire meets the Atlantic here. The concrete still stands. And the story of how the world's most powerful submarine base was built, was contested, was bombed into irrelevance, and finally fell silent. That story begins now. There is a place on the western edge of France where a great river meets the sea. The Loire, one of the longest rivers in Europe, does not surrender quietly to the Atlantic. It broadens, it slows, and it spreads across a wide estuary before finally losing itself in the open ocean. On the southern bank of that estuary, roughly 60 kilometers from the open sea, sits a city that spent most of its history in comfortable obscurity. Saint-Nazaire was, for centuries, a working port, practical, unglamorous, built not on prestige but on function. Shipbuilders lived here, dock workers raised families here. The town smelled of brine and engine grease, and the particular exhaustion of men who worked with their hands. Nothing about it suggested destiny, and yet the geography surrounding it, the deep water channels, the sheltered reach of the Loire, and the proximity to the vast Atlantic hunting grounds, would make it one of the most contested pieces of real estate in the entire Second World War. To understand why German naval planners fixed their attention on Saint-Nazaire almost immediately after the fall of France, you have to begin with the water. The Loire estuary is not simply a wide mouth at the end of a river. It is a complex, tidal system, governed by some of the largest tidal ranges on the French Atlantic coast. The difference between high tide and low tide at Saint-Nazaire can exceed 5 meters under the right conditions. For most vessels, that kind of tidal variation is an inconvenience. For a submarine base that needed to move large, deep-draft boats in and out of port on a reliable schedule, it was a factor that could not be ignored. The Germans needed a port where the water was deep enough, where the channel was wide enough, and where the tidal window was generous enough to allow operational submarines to transit safely at virtually any hour of the day or night. Saint-Nazaire, with careful management, offered precisely that. The natural geography alone would not have been enough. What elevated Saint-Nazaire above every other candidate on the Atlantic coast was the infrastructure already waiting there when the Germans arrived. Before the war, the town had grown into one of France's most important shipbuilding centers. The great ocean liner Normandy, at the time of her launch the largest and fastest passenger ship in the world, had been built in the yards at Saint-Nazaire. To construct and service ships of that magnitude, the port had accumulated an extraordinary collection of heavy engineering facilities. There were dry docks of enormous scale, capable of accepting the largest vessels afloat. There were machine shops, crane gantries, fuel storage facilities, and electrical systems robust enough to sustain industrial-scale repair work around the clock. A German admiral, looking at a map of the Atlantic coast in the summer of 1940, was not simply looking at a port. He was looking at a fully equipped naval workshop, sitting at the edge of the ocean, pointed directly at Britain's supply lines. The strategic logic was almost brutally simple. Britain was an island nation. Everything she needed to fight, food, fuel, raw materials, weapons, the men to use them, had to cross the Atlantic by ship. If those ships could be sunk faster than they could be replaced, Britain would be strangled. The submarine, the U-boat, was the primary instrument of that strategy. But a submarine is not a self-sufficient weapon. It needs fuel, torpedoes, food, spare parts, and above all, it needs a place to come home to. A place where crews can rest, where damaged pressure hulls can be repaired, where engines can be overhauled. Before the fall of France, German submarines had been operating from ports inside Germany itself, adding days of transit through contested and heavily patrolled waters before they could even reach the Atlantic. A base on the French coast changed everything. It cut the transit time dramatically. It extended the time each submarine could spend actively hunting in the Atlantic. It multiplied the effective striking power of the entire U-boat arm without adding a single hull to the German fleet. The men who commanded Germany's submarine force understood this arithmetic with complete clarity. Admiral Karl Dönitz, the architect of German underwater warfare, had been arguing for a larger submarine fleet and better basing arrangements since before the war began. When France collapsed, he moved with striking speed. Within weeks of the armistice, German naval officers were walking the docks at Saint-Nazaire, measuring depths, inspecting machinery, and calculating what would be needed to transform this French shipbuilding town into the forward base of an ocean war. What they found exceeded their most optimistic projections. The existing dry dock facilities at Saint-Nazaire included one structure of particular importance, a lock and dry dock combination known as the Four Macluses. built specifically to accommodate the Normandy. It was, at the time, the largest dry dock in the world, outside of Southampton. For the German Navy, it represented something irreplaceable. The only facility on the entire Atlantic coast capable of docking and repairing their largest surface warships, including the great battleships that Germany hoped to use in combination with submarines to break British sea power. The Loire estuary offered one further advantage that the Germans valued deeply: concealment and defense. The estuary approaches from the sea are not straightforward. Sandbanks shift with the seasons. The main navigable channel requires local knowledge and careful pilotage. An attacking naval force, trying to approach Saint-Nazaire from the sea, would face hazards that gave even experienced mariners pause. The town itself sits far enough upriver that aircraft attacking from the west had to penetrate significant distances over land or water, giving early warning systems time to respond. The surrounding flatlands offered fields of fire for anti-aircraft batteries. The river itself, broad and powerful, provided a natural barrier to any land approach from the north. Nowhere on the Atlantic coast offered quite the same combination of deep water, existing facilities, natural defensive barriers, and proximity to the open ocean. Every other candidate had some flaw. Saint-Nazaire had none that the Germans could not manage. There was also the question of what the Germans would need to build from scratch and what they could inherit. In most of the ports they occupied along the French coast, the Germans faced substantial rebuilding work. At Saint-Nazaire, the core of what they needed already existed. The fuel storage infrastructure could be adapted and expanded. The electrical grid was capable of handling the demands of a modern naval base. The machine shops contained equipment that German engineers could put to use almost immediately. The local workforce, however reluctant, possessed skills that translated directly into the labor demands of submarine maintenance and repair. There was a dark pragmatism to the German assessment. They were not choosing Saint-Nazaire because it was the easiest port to fortify. They were choosing it because it was the one place on the Atlantic coast where they could begin operations at speed, and where the natural and industrial assets aligned closely enough with their requirements that the gap between what existed and what they needed was manageable. The civilian population of Saint-Nazaire numbered somewhere around 50,000 people at the time of the occupation. They were not consulted. They were not asked whether they wanted their town to become the headquarters of a submarine war against their allies. The fishermen who had worked the estuary for generations, the shipyard workers who had built the most celebrated ocean liners in the world, the shopkeepers and teachers and dockhands, all of them woke one morning to find that their home had been requisitioned by history. The port that had given the town its identity and its livelihood was now a military installation, and the town itself was now a garrison. German soldiers walked the streets. German engineers measured the dry docks. German flags flew over the buildings that had once processed passenger luggage bound for New York. What the Germans were creating at Saint-Nazaire was not simply a port facility. It was the physical expression of a strategic idea. The idea that the Atlantic could be made so dangerous for Allied shipping that Britain would be brought to her knees. Every decision they made about infrastructure, fortification, and basing was oriented around one goal: keeping submarines at sea, hunting, for as long as possible. The French coast had handed them a forward position that compressed the geometry of ocean warfare in their favor. From Saint-Nazaire, a U-boat could reach the convoy routes off the British Isles in a fraction of the time it would have taken from a German port. From Saint-Nazaire, a submarine could operate in the mid-Atlantic, off the American coast, or in the waters around the Azores, and still return to a fully equipped base capable of restoring it to fighting condition within days. The town's transformation had barely begun before the first concrete mixers arrived. The Germans understood, perhaps better than any military power of the era, that the structures they were planning to build would need to withstand not just time and weather, but aerial bombardment of a scale and intensity that had never been seen in warfare. They were already thinking about Allied retaliation. They were already calculating the weight of bombs that might fall on what they were building. The answer they reached, the answer that would define Saint-Nazaire's physical character for the rest of the war, and far beyond, was concrete. More concrete than seemed possible, thicker walls than seemed necessary. Roofs that were not roofs in any conventional sense, but were massive slabs of reinforced aggregate, engineered to absorb punishment that would reduce any ordinary structure to rubble. Saint-Nazaire was not the largest city on the French Atlantic coast. It was not the most famous port, nor the most historically significant. It had no particular claim on greatness before the summer of 1940, but geography is indifferent to human preferences. The Loire estuary did not care about the ambitions of the men who arrived on its southern bank with plans and machinery and the full weight of an occupying power behind them. The water was what it was. The tides ran as they always had. The deep channel held its course regardless of who sailed through it. What changed was everything around the water, the structures, the weapons, the purpose, and the human cost. A modest French port town was about to become something it had never asked to be, the most fortified submarine base on Earth, and the forward edge of a battle that would determine the fate of the Atlantic War. France had long carried the weight of its own mythology, the memory of Verdun, of the Marne, of 4 grinding years that had bled a generation white. These were not simply history lessons, but the foundations of a national identity built around resistance, sacrifice, and ultimate survival. When the 1930s deepened into crisis, France looked at its border with Germany and trusted in the Maginot Line, that vast chain of steel and concrete fortifications stretching along the frontier, and believed that whatever came next could be held, could be absorbed, could be survived again. The High Command in Paris had planned for a war that resembled the last one. They were planning for the wrong war entirely. In May of 1940, German armoured columns crossed into France and the Low Countries with a speed and ferocity that the Allied command structure simply could not process. The decisive thrust came not through the fortified frontier, but through the Ardennes forest, terrain the French generals had judged impassable for armoured vehicles. They had judged wrongly. Within days, the axis of the entire Western Front had been fractured. Allied armies were being pushed toward the sea, and the careful defensive logic that had governed French strategic thinking for 2 decades collapsed like paper in a fire. The speed of the German advance was not merely a military event. It was a psychological shock from which the French High Command never fully recovered. By late May, the British Expeditionary Force and a significant portion of the French army had been pushed to the beaches at Dunkirk, and the evacuation that followed, however remarkable in its execution, was a retreat dressed in the language of resilience. France continued to fight for several more weeks, but the strategic initiative had passed irrevocably to Germany. The French government fled Paris, then declared it an open city to spare it destruction. Columns of refugees clogged every road heading south and west, and among those streams of displaced humanity were men, women, and children from the coastal towns of the West, from Brittany, from the Loire estuary, from Saint-Nazaire itself. What they carried with them, above all else, was uncertainty about whether anything they had known would survive the weeks ahead. Saint-Nazaire, sitting at the mouth of the Loire on France's Atlantic coast, had spent the early weeks of the campaign in a particular kind of anxious suspension. It was not a frontline city. The fighting was happening far to the northeast, and for a brief period, the town continued to function. The port, the shipyards, the everyday commerce of a working harbour. But the war came to Saint-Nazaire in a form that no one had anticipated. In the chaos of the French collapse, the port became a desperate embarkation point, the last viable exit for Allied troops, civilians, and equipment that could not reach Dunkirk. Tens of thousands of soldiers and refugees flooded toward the harbour, and the ships waiting there, including the enormous British liner that would become the most tragic single casualty of the entire evacuation, represented the last hope of organized escape before the German tide closed in entirely. The sinking of that passenger ship in the waters off Saint-Nazaire in mid-June of 1940 was one of the great unacknowledged disasters of the war. Thousands drowned within sight of the coast, in an event so catastrophic that British authorities suppressed news of it for fear of undermining civilian morale. But within days, that catastrophe became almost irrelevant to the immediate strategic picture, because France had already effectively ceased to resist. The armistice was signed on the 22nd of June 1940 in a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne. The same carriage, the same location, deliberately chosen by Hitler to humiliate France with the mirror image of Germany's own defeat in 1918. The symbolism was calculated and complete. German forces moved west and south to occupy the Atlantic coastline, rapidly following the armistice. For Saint-Nazaire, the arrival of German troops was not heralded by sustained fighting or dramatic destruction. The port infrastructure, the dry docks, the shipyard cranes, the deep water berths, the repair facilities, passed into German hands largely intact. This was not entirely accidental. The speed of the German advance and the terms of the armistice, together, created conditions in which organized French demolition of the port's most valuable facilities never materialized at scale. The Germans had moved too quickly for systematic denial operations, and French political and military authority had disintegrated too completely for anyone to coordinate meaningful resistance at a local level. What remained was a functioning, undamaged, deep-water Atlantic port, one of the finest on the entire western coast of Europe. German naval officers surveying Saint-Nazaire in the weeks following the armistice could scarcely believe the scale of what had fallen into their hands. The port's facilities, already substantial from decades of commercial shipping and transatlantic passenger trade, were capable of handling vessels of considerable size. The deep water channel, carved by the Loire estuary, offered reliable access regardless of tide. The existing infrastructure of cranes, machine shops, dry docks, and storage facilities meant that turning Saint-Nazaire into an operational naval base would require expansion and fortification. Yes, but the foundation was already there, already functioning, already proven by years of heavy commercial and maritime use. For an admiral planning to wage sustained submarine warfare across the North Atlantic, this was not a captured town. It was a gift. The German military administration established itself in Saint-Nazaire with the efficient purposefulness that characterized the early occupation everywhere in France. Requisitions began almost immediately. Buildings, vehicles, supplies, the labor and knowledge of local workers. The civilian population found itself navigating an entirely new reality with remarkable speed, as the familiar rhythms of port life were overlaid with German authority, German signage, German uniforms moving through the streets. The occupation was, in these early weeks, largely a matter of logistics and administration, rather than overt brutality. The Germans needed the port to function, needed local expertise and cooperation, and the initial relationship between occupier and occupied was shaped by that practical calculation on both sides. Collaboration was not simply a moral failing. For many, It was the only available vocabulary. Yet even as that everyday negotiation was beginning, the deeper purpose of the German occupation of Saint-Nazaire was becoming visible. Naval planners from the Kriegsmarine arrived alongside the first military administrators, and their surveys of the port were not the assessments of garrison commanders securing a territorial acquisition. They were the evaluations of engineers and strategists, identifying the bones of something they intended to transform entirely. The Loire estuary's geography told them what they needed to know. Positioned on the Atlantic coast, free from the narrow constrictions of the English Channel that limited options further north, Saint-Nazaire offered direct, open ocean access to the western approaches and the convoy routes that sustained Britain's survival. Every week, hundreds of Allied merchant vessels crossed those waters. Every week, they carried food, fuel, weapons, and raw materials that kept Britain in the war. The men measuring docks and calculating concrete requirements in June of 1940 were already thinking about how to cut those lines. The establishment of German authority over Saint-Nazaire also placed the port within the broader strategic logic that Germany's naval command, under Admiral Karl Dönitz, had been articulating for months. Dönitz had long argued that the U-boat was Germany's most powerful instrument for bringing Britain to her knees, not through dramatic fleet engagements, but through the slow, relentless strangulation of supply lines. The surface fleet had its role, but submarines, properly based, properly supplied, and properly deployed in coordinated groups, could achieve something that battleships could not: the systematic destruction of the merchant tonnage on which Britain's war economy depended. For that strategy to work at full effect, Germany needed Atlantic bases, ports that were not bottled up in the North Sea, ports from which submarines could reach open water without running the gauntlet of British naval patrols. Saint-Nazaire was exactly what that strategy required, and France's fall had handed it over without a prolonged siege or a contested landing. Within weeks of the armistice, the character of Saint-Nazaire was already beginning to change in ways that would accelerate dramatically through the following year. The town's streets, its harbour, its shipyards, all of them were being mapped, assessed, and redesignated according to a military logic that had nothing to do with commerce or civilian life. Signs went up in German. Restricted zones appeared around the waterfront. Local workers found that their expertise was now directed by German overseers toward purposes that were not their own. The French civilian population of Saint-Nazaire was not expelled. The Germans needed the workforce, needed the institutional knowledge embedded in the shipyard trades, needed the port to keep functioning while it was simultaneously being converted into something far more formidable. But the town's identity as a French community was already being subordinated to its new identity as a German military installation, and that subordination would only deepen as the concrete began to rise. What had taken decades to build, Saint-Nazaire's reputation as one of France's premier Atlantic ports, a place of transatlantic liners and deep-water commerce, had been transformed in a matter of weeks into the forward anchor of a submarine war that would reach across an entire ocean. The speed of that transformation said something important about the nature of what was coming. This was not an occupation that intended to pause or consolidate. The Germans who had taken Saint-Nazaire were already thinking about the next phase, the construction phase, the phase in which this captured port would be made not merely useful, but impregnable. The sound of machinery that had once built liners would soon serve a very different kind of vessel, and the concrete that had once formed the floors of great dry docks would be poured upward, thicker and thicker, into structures designed to outlast the war itself. Before the first submarine had even completed its second patrol from the Loire estuary, the engineers were already there. They arrived with blueprints, soil surveys, and a mandate that carried the full weight of the Reich's industrial machine behind it. What they intended to build on the western edge of occupied France was not merely a shelter or a repair yard. It was a monument to permanence, a structure designed to outlast the war itself, to outlast the men who built it, and perhaps to outlast the very ambitions that had called it into being. Saint-Nazaire was about to be remade from the ground up, and the transformation would consume years, tens of thousands of lives, and quantities of concrete that strained even Germany's vast wartime production. The organization chosen to deliver this undertaking was the TOT organization, the Reich's great engine of military construction, named for its founder and already hardened by years of highway building, fortification work, and the engineering demands of a war being fought on multiple fronts. It brought with it a workforce unlike anything the Loire estuary had seen before. German engineers, specialists, and managers formed the technical backbone of the project, carrying the expertise required to design and oversee structures of extraordinary complexity. But the sheer labor required, the mixing, the pouring, the hauling, the scaffolding, demanded numbers far beyond what German manpower could supply. French workers were conscripted from the surrounding region, some volunteering for wages that represented real income in an occupied and economically strangled country. Others pressed into service with little genuine choice. As the project grew and its appetite for labor expanded, workers arrived from across occupied Europe, drawn or driven from the Netherlands, Belgium, and further east. At the height of construction, estimates placed the workforce at many tens of thousands of men laboring simultaneously across the site. The fundamental engineering problem facing the designers was not how to build a base for submarines. It was how to build one that no aircraft yet conceived could destroy. By 1940, the Royal Air Force had already demonstrated its willingness to strike port facilities along the occupied coast, and German naval planners harbored no illusions that Saint-Nazaire would be spared. The solution, conceived with characteristic German thoroughness, was mass. The U-boat pens would not simply have roofs. They would have roofs of reinforced concrete so thick, so densely packed with steel rebar, and so carefully engineered in cross-section that a bomb falling from any altitude then achievable would either detonate on the outer surface, losing much of its force to the open air above, or penetrate only partway into the concrete mass before stopping. The roofs that resulted, when finally completed, reached thicknesses that no conventional bomb of the period could reliably defeat. Construction began in the summer of 1940, with the ground barely dry from the German advance. The site chosen occupied the inner basin of the old port, a stretch of waterfront where the existing infrastructure, quayside cranes, access roads, and the proximity of the Loire for cooling and industrial water supply could be pressed immediately into service. Workers drove timber pilings deep into the estuarine mud to create a stable foundation, a task that in itself consumed weeks and revealed the engineering complexity that would define the entire project. The Loire estuary's tidal range was substantial, meaning that the base of the structure had to be calculated against water levels that shifted significantly across each day. Every foundation pour, every shuttering frame, every concrete batch had to account for a site that was, in a real sense, never quite still. The pens themselves were designed in a row configuration, each one a long rectangular chamber running parallel to the quayside, deep enough to accept a submarine at any tidal state, wide enough to allow maintenance work along both flanks, and tall enough to permit cranes to lift diesel engines and heavy machinery directly from the boat's hull. Between the individual chambers, massive concrete dividing walls carried the weight of the roof above and provided structural rigidity against both bomb blast and the lateral forces generated by water. At the seaward end, the pens opened through large reinforced gates to the inner basin, and submariners returning from patrol would nose their vessels slowly into these dark, echoing tunnels, to be received by the mechanics and supply teams waiting inside. The atmosphere inside a completed pen was one of controlled industrial noise, compressors, welding torches, the clank of heavy tools, amplified and reflected by those vast concrete walls until the sound became a constant, enveloping presence. The concrete itself was a story of industrial logistics almost as complex as the engineering. Aggregate, sand, and cement had to move continuously to the site in quantities that strained the regional rail network and the roads connecting Saint-Nazaire to the rest of occupied France. German military planners had earmarked specific supply chains for the project, and local French commercial traffic frequently found itself displaced or requisitioned to feed the site's hunger. Mixing plants were established directly on the waterfront, their drums running around the clock on rotating shifts, because the poor schedules demanded by the structural engineers could not wait for convenient working hours. Night construction became routine, the site lit by temporary electrical floodlights whose glow was visible from considerable distance, a faint industrial aurora along the western French coastline. Alongside the submarine pens themselves, the construction effort extended across a much broader footprint. Workshops for torpedo maintenance and loading occupied, purpose-built reinforced buildings adjacent to the main pen structure, fuel storage facilities, partially buried and heavily protected, held the quantities of diesel oil that a flotilla of operational submarines required. Accommodation blocks, administrative offices, communications facilities, and medical infrastructure all had to be constructed or heavily adapted from existing buildings. A dedicated power supply was established, independent enough from the town's civilian grid to ensure that a successful bombing strike on Saint-Nazaire's commercial infrastructure would not darken the base itself. The whole complex was, in the ambitions of its designers, intended to be a self-sustaining military organism, capable of functioning even in conditions of sustained siege. The human cost of building this fortress accumulated quietly beneath the noise of the construction itself. Accidents were common and sometimes fatal on a site where concrete was being poured from great heights, where timber formwork collapsed under load, and where the compressed schedules allowed little margin for safety precautions. The conscripted French workers occupied a particular position of vulnerability, subject to German military discipline, while receiving none of the protections extended to soldiers. Some were housed in temporary camps on the periphery of the site, in conditions that deteriorated as the workforce expanded faster than the accommodation could grow. Food supply was an ongoing problem, with the German military requisitioning local agricultural produce for the garrison and the construction workforce left to compete for what remained in an already strained wartime economy. The workforce endured this not in silence, but in the particular silence of people who understood that resistance carried consequences. German military engineers working alongside the TOT organization brought a level of technical oversight that was, in purely structural terms, remarkable. The design of the roof sections incorporated lessons already learned from other construction projects across occupied Europe, and the engineers at Saint-Nazaire pushed their specifications beyond what had been achieved elsewhere. They were building not just for the present threat of British bombing, but for an anticipated future in which heavier aircraft carrying heavier bombs would eventually appear. That engineering foresight would prove, over the coming years, to be entirely justified. When the Royal Air Force returned again and again with increasing bomb loads and more accurate navigation, it would discover that the structures built along the Loire in those frantic months of 1940 and 1941 had been designed to absorb exactly that kind of punishment. By the end of 1941, the main pen structure was substantially complete and operational, even as finishing work continued around it. The first submarines had already been using the facility in an early form for months, pulled beneath the unfinished roof sections as a precaution against air attack, even before the concrete had fully cured. The completed structure presented an extraordinary face to anyone approaching by water. A long, low, grey mass sitting at the edge of the basin, utterly unadorned, without the decorative gestures of civilian architecture, expressing in its blunt geometry precisely what it was. Not a building that sought to fit into its surroundings, but one that announced its own indestructibility. The full construction program continued into 1942 as additional modifications, extensions, and protective measures were added to the existing structure. The lessons of early bombing raids were incorporated as they accumulated. Blast walls were thickened, vulnerable external pipelines were rerouted into protected channels, and entrance approaches were modified to improve protection against the low-angle attacks that some British aircraft were beginning to experiment with. The TOT organization's teams adapted with the speed of an organization that had learned to treat wartime construction as a continuous and evolving process, rather than a project with a defined completion point. There was always something more to reinforce, always another vulnerability to address, always another section of the perimeter to harden against the threat that was, by this stage, arriving with increasing regularity from the west. What emerged from those 2 years of intensive construction was a military installation of a kind that had no real precedent in the history of warfare at sea. No naval base built before the era of heavy aerial bombardment had needed to be engineered against destruction from above. Saint-Nazaire's bunker was both a response to that new reality and a defiance of it, a declaration, pressed into tens of thousands of cubic meters of reinforced concrete, that German naval power in the Atlantic could be made structurally immune to the weapons of its enemies. Whether that ambition could ultimately be sustained was a question that the war itself would answer, slowly and at great cost. But in the grey concrete face of the completed pens, standing solid against the tidal light of the Loire estuary, the ambition itself was undeniable. The concrete was still wet in places when the first boats arrived. Cranes swung above half-finished quays, and the smell of fresh mortar hung in the salt air, alongside the diesel exhaust of submarines easing into their new berths. Saint-Nazaire, in the autumn of 1940, was a port in the middle of becoming something else entirely, not quite finished, not quite ready, and yet already open for war. The U-boats could not wait for the builders to complete their work. The Atlantic was there, and the merchant lanes across it were thick with targets. So the boats came early, guided by harbour pilots who had learned these tidal approaches under very different masters, and they slipped into the Loire estuary, with their battle flags flying and their crews thin from weeks at sea. The organization that would govern life and death across those Atlantic lanes already had a name and a structure. The Second Submarine Flotilla, known in German naval records as the Zweite Unterseebootsflottille, had existed before the occupation, but its transfer to Saint-Nazaire marked something fundamentally new. This was no longer a force operating from the German homeland, running long transits across the North Sea and around the British Isles before reaching the open ocean. From the Bay of Biscay, the boats could reach the mid-Atlantic shipping lanes in a fraction of the time that had previously been necessary. Every day saved in transit was another day of operational hunting, another stretch of sea where a periscope might find a convoy plodding southwest with its cargo of oil, grain, and ammunition. The flotilla's establishment at Saint-Nazaire was not merely a logistical adjustment, it was a strategic lever of enormous power. The men who commanded the flotilla understood the geography of advantage with absolute clarity. A U-boat that had previously required perhaps 10 days simply to reach its operational area could now be on station in roughly 4. Fuel reserves that had once been consumed crossing the North Sea approaches were now preserved for the hunt itself. A crew that had arrived at their patrol zone, already worn from a long transit, could instead arrive relatively rested, watchful, and sharp. These were not marginal gains. Across hundreds of patrols and thousands of days at sea, they accumulated into something that the Allied naval staff tracked with growing alarm on the maps in London. The lines charting merchant ship losses crept steadily upward through the months of late 1940, and Saint-Nazaire sat behind every one of those losses like a hidden engine driving them forward. The flotilla's administrative heart was established in commandeered buildings near the waterfront, where naval staff officers bent over charts and signal logs, coordinating the movements of boats that might be scattered across hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of open ocean. Communication was everything in submarine warfare, and the flotilla headquarters became a relay point between the operational commanders at sea and the broader strategic direction coming from the Naval High Command. Signals went out, encoding patrol zones, convoy routes derived from intelligence intercepts, and the positions of other boats already at sea. The wolf pack system, the Rudel tactic that Admiral Dönitz had long championed, depended on this kind of central coordination. One boat might sight a convoy and shadow it, radioing its position and course, while other boats were vectored in from across the patrol area. The attack, when it came, would arrive from multiple directions across the night hours, overwhelming the convoy's escorts and leaving the merchant ships exposed. The physical rhythm of the base began to establish itself in those early months, with a regularity that almost resembled peacetime routine. A boat would return from patrol, often battered, sometimes barely seaworthy, its crew hollow-eyed and smelling of the peculiar interior air that anyone who had never been inside a submerged submarine could not quite imagine. Diesel oil, unwashed bodies, mildew, and the faint sweetness of bilge water. The dockworkers would swarm over the hull almost before the lines were secured. Torpedoes were the first priority, lifted by crane from the quayside and lowered through the forward hatch with practiced efficiency. Fresh provisions followed: bread, vegetables, anything that could not survive the weeks of patrol. And then the engineers would begin their examination of everything mechanical that had been asked to function under impossible conditions. A U-boat that had crossed the Atlantic and back had lived hard, and the base workshops at Saint-Nazaire were the only reason it could do so again. The turnaround times that the flotilla staff worked to achieve were a constant tension between the needs of the mechanics and the demands of the operational calendar. Dönitz wanted his boats at sea, not sitting in harbour. Every week a boat spent being repaired was a week it spent not sinking ships, and the tonnage war that the Admiral had made the strategic centre of his thinking required a continuous flow of submarines through the Atlantic lanes. The base staff became extraordinarily skilled at prioritising repairs, identifying what was essential and what could be deferred until the next return, pushing men and machines to stay at the edge of mechanical tolerance. The crews themselves, after a few days of rest, hot food, and sleep in actual beds, would be cycled back to operational readiness before they had quite stopped dreaming of the sea they had just escaped. It was a demanding cycle, and it was by design. The crews who moved through Saint-Nazaire during these early months came from across the German submarine arm, young men for the most part, drawn from naval academies and training flotillas, and the peculiar fraternity of men who found that the confined world of a submarine suited them. There was a culture forming around the bases on the Atlantic coast, a kind of warrior identity that the German Naval Command actively cultivated. Decorated officers were celebrated publicly, their photographs appearing in German newspapers and newsreel footage. The Knight's Cross, the war's most visible military honor, was awarded with notable frequency to successful U-boat commanders, and when a decorated commander returned to Saint-Nazaire, the welcome on the quayside carried a weight of official theatre as much as genuine camaraderie. The base was becoming not just a military installation, but a symbol, the visible face of German naval power in the West. Beyond the official celebrations, the daily reality of the base was more complicated and more human. Men who had spent weeks submerged in a steel tube had needs that no amount of ceremony could fully address. The German Naval Command made deliberate provision for rest and recreation in Saint-Nazaire and the surrounding region. Understanding that a submarine crew pushed past its psychological limits was a liability, not an asset. There were supervised recreational facilities, access to the French countryside on day passes, and the particular strange intimacy of an occupying force living alongside a population that had not chosen their presence. The French townspeople watched the Germans with expressions that varied from careful neutrality to barely concealed hatred, and the submarine crews, for their part, largely understood that they inhabited a borrowed world that had been seized rather than offered. The Wolfpack attacks that Saint-Nazaire coordinated during these months were among the most operationally effective submarine actions of the entire war at sea. Convoys that had crossed the Atlantic in relative safety during earlier periods now found themselves tracked across vast stretches of open ocean, the contact reports going out from a shadowing boat as the headquarters staff assembled the strike. The escorts available to convoy commanders in this period were often too few in number, too limited in equipment, and too widely spread across the convoy's perimeter to respond effectively when the attacks came simultaneously from multiple bearings. Ships were sunk in numbers that, when read in plain terms, represent an almost incomprehensible scale of destruction. Cargoes that had taken weeks to load, crews that had no military training, vessels that burned or sank in minutes once a torpedo found them. The Loire estuary was a long way from those scenes, but the organization housed along its banks was responsible for a significant share of what happened in those distant waters. The port's role extended beyond the Second Flotilla's own operational boats. Saint-Nazaire was positioned to serve as a resupply and repair facility for boats from other flotillas that happened to be operating in ranges that made it a more practical refuge than returning all the way east. Damaged boats that might not survive a longer voyage could be nursed into the Loire. Boats running critically low on fuel or torpedoes mid-patrol could put in for emergency resupply and be back at sea within days rather than weeks. This flexibility made Saint-Nazaire a kind of regional hub for the entire Atlantic submarine campaign, extending its operational influence beyond whatever organizational charts formally suggested. The base's importance, in other words, was both official and improvisational. It served the forces assigned to it, and also served as a lifeline for whatever came to it in need. By the end of 1940, and into the opening weeks of 1941, the pattern was entrenched. The boats went out, the boats came back. The workshops turned them around, and they went out again. The construction crews still labored overhead on the great concrete structures that would eventually shelter the submarines from the bombing that everyone in German Naval Command understood was eventually coming. But in those first operational months, the base functioned with the energy of an enterprise that believed, with some justification, given what was happening in the Atlantic, that it was winning. The signals coming back from patrol commanders described ships sinking in numbers that exceeded even the most optimistic projections. The men on the quayside who greeted the returning boats were greeting, as they understood it, a vanguard of eventual victory. What they could not yet see, and what no calculation available to them in those autumn and winter months could have revealed, was that the forces already beginning to accumulate against them, in laboratories, in shipyards, in the minds of Allied naval strategists, studying the loss figures with cold determination, would eventually prove more durable than any tactical advantage born of geography. Saint Nazaire was as well positioned as any port on the European coast for the war the U-boat arm was fighting. It was superbly organized, increasingly well-equipped, and staffed by men who believed in what they were doing. All of that was true, and none of it would be enough when the time came. But the time had not yet come, for now, in the cold waters beyond the Bay of Biscay, the second flotilla's boats were hunting, and the base on the Loire was the beating heart of that hunt. There is a particular cruelty to prosperity during wartime. It is most dangerous, not when things are desperate, but when they appear effortless, when every operation succeeds, when every patrol returns with claims of tonnage sunk, when the enemy seems unable to answer. For the men of the German submarine arm, operating from Saint-Nazaire in those early years of the war, the Atlantic felt like an open road, with no barriers, no speed limits, and no police in sight. They had a phrase for it. They called it die glückliche Zeit, the happy time, and for a period stretching from late 1940 through the opening months of 1942, that name was devastatingly accurate. The foundation of this success was not accidental. It was the product of geography, timing, and a structural failure on the Allied side that the Germans exploited with ruthless efficiency. Britain stood alone, her merchant lifeline stretching across thousands of miles of open ocean, and her naval resources stretched thin across every theater of war simultaneously. The convoys that carried food, fuel, ammunition, and raw materials across the North Atlantic were the arteries of British survival, and the U-boats operating from Saint-Nazaire went after those arteries with surgical intent. The port's position at the mouth of the Loire gave submarines immediate access to deep Atlantic water without the long, exposed transit through the English Channel that had plagued earlier operations. Every day saved in transit was another day a boat could spend hunting. The submarine commanders who sailed from Saint-Nazaire during this period became figures of extraordinary reputation within the German naval establishment. Their patrol reports, transmitted back to the base by radio and then compiled by flotilla staff into operational summaries, catalogued destruction on a scale that astonished even their own superiors. Individual patrols could account for dozens of thousands of tons of Allied shipping in a single voyage. The tonnage figures grew week by week, then month by month, accumulating into totals that represented not just steel and cargo, but lives, supply chains, and the slow erosion of Britain's capacity to sustain herself. The men who achieved these results were celebrated on their return, greeted at the quayside with ceremony, and the knowledge that they had done what had been asked of them, and more. Wolf-pack tactics had begun to develop during this period into a genuine operational art. The concept was straightforward enough in principle. Instead of allowing individual submarines to hunt alone, U-boats would be directed by shore-based command to converge on a convoy position, overwhelming the escorts through sheer numbers and attacking in coordinated waves, often at night on the surface, where their low silhouette made detection extremely difficult. Saint-Nazaire, as the home of the second submarine flotilla, became the coordinating headquarters for these operations across a vast stretch of ocean. The flotilla staff worked alongside the broader command structure to manage patrol lines, assign sectors, and redirect boats responding to contact reports. It was an industrial approach to naval warfare, systematic, calculated, and coldly effective during these years of Allied weakness. The port itself hummed with the energy of apparent victory. When a boat returned from patrol, It came in under flags, one pennant for each ship claimed sunk, streaming from the conning tower as it moved through the harbor entrance. Crews lined the dock. Officers offered handshakes and congratulations. The base's repair facilities, still being expanded throughout this period, worked continuously to turn boats around as quickly as possible, getting them back to sea before the Allied response could adapt. Rest periods for crews were compressed where possible. The pressure was on not because things were going badly, but because the opportunity seemed too vast to waste. Every week at sea was another chance to strike before the Allies found their footing. Then, in December 1941, the strategic picture shifted in a direction the submarines had not anticipated. And for once, the shift worked temporarily in their favor. The United States entered the war. Almost immediately, the American eastern seaboard became a killing ground of a kind that even the wolf pack commanders had not previously imagined. American coastal cities kept their lights burning at night, having not yet accepted the reality of war on their doorstep. Merchant ships sailed independently, without convoy, without escort, running on predictable coastal routes that U-boat commanders could study and exploit with ease. What followed in the weeks and months after American entry was carnage on a scale that shocked even hardened German submariners. Tankers and freighters were silhouetted against the glow of resort towns and commercial ports, their outlines crisp and clear to periscopes and surface-running submarines alike. The boats operating off the American coast during these months sometimes had more targets than they could engage before their torpedoes ran out. The Germans had a name for this phase of the campaign too. Some crews called it the Second Happy Time, or the American Shooting Season. Whatever the name, the operational results were staggering. Month after month, the tonnage figures climbed to levels that, in theory, should have been unsustainable for the Allied merchant fleet. The boats operating in these waters were sending back reports that read less like military dispatches and more like accounts of almost uncontested slaughter. The men doing this work were not monsters. Most were professional sailors following orders within the brutal logic of unrestricted submarine warfare. But the system they operated within was consuming human lives and industrial capacity at a rate that threatened to break the transatlantic supply chain altogether. From the offices and corridors of Saint-Nazaire's base, the results of these distant patrols were tracked, tabulated, and celebrated. Back at the base, the logistical machinery supporting all of this continued to grow in sophistication. The supply system that fed submarines heading into the Atlantic from Saint-Nazaire was not simply a matter of fuel and food. Torpedoes required careful handling, maintenance, and preloading to exacting specifications. Mechanical faults discovered during patrols needed rapid diagnosis and repair when boats returned, often within timelines of days rather than weeks. Diesel engines had to be inspected, overhauled where necessary, and certified ready for sea before another departure. The base's engineering workshops operated around the clock during periods of high operational tempo, and the expertise concentrated at Saint-Nazaire during these years was formidable. French workers, some coerced, some finding a pragmatic accommodation with the occupation, worked alongside German technicians in the repair halls, and the whole enterprise functioned with the grim efficiency of a wartime industrial complex. The men who crewed these submarines existed in a world entirely their own, separated from the rest of the war by the peculiar nature of their service. A patrol might last weeks or months. Much of that time was spent underwater, in conditions of almost unbearable physical claustrophobia, heat, noise, and the constant smell of diesel and human bodies in confined space. The psychological demands were severe, even during the happy time, when success made the hardship feel purposeful. Veterans of multiple patrols developed a detachment, a professional calm that could look like coldness from the outside, but was really a survival mechanism. The only way a man could keep functioning when the depth charges started falling, or when a contact that had appeared on the hydrophone suddenly resolved into a warship rather than a freighter. At Saint-Nazaire, between patrols, these men were given leave, access to rest facilities, and something approaching ordinary life. For a little while, in a port town under occupation, they could almost forget what they did for a living. The French population of Saint-Nazaire existed in a different relationship with all of this. The town had been occupied since the summer of 1940, and by 1941 and into 1942, the presence of the German submarine base had transformed the social and economic fabric of the port entirely. German sailors on leave moved through the town's streets, its cafes, its markets. The base employed significant numbers of local civilians in various capacities, from construction and maintenance to catering and clerical work. Collaboration and resistance existed simultaneously, often within the same families, sometimes within the same individuals, as different circumstances demanded different calculations. The happy time was not something the people of Saint-Nazaire experienced. It was something happening to the world beyond them, the consequences of which they could not fully grasp and had no power to affect. And yet, beneath the surface of all this apparent German success, the structural weaknesses of the U-boat strategy were already present, invisible but real. The Allied merchant fleet was enormous, and though the losses were catastrophic by any conventional measure, the shipyards on both sides of the Atlantic were beginning to accelerate their output in ways that would eventually outpace even the worst rates of loss. American industrial capacity, once mobilized, would prove to be a force of a different magnitude than anything the German naval planners had modeled. The convoy system, already in place for British waters, was slowly being extended and refined. Technology for detecting submerged submarines, radar sets capable of picking up a conning tower in darkness, improved hydrophones, better depth charge patterns, was being developed with urgent priority by Allied scientists and engineers who understood exactly what was at stake. The happy time had a clock running on it that the men at Saint-Nazaire could not yet hear. The year 1942 would mark a turning point, though it would take months before that turn was visible in the patrol reports and tonnage tallies. For now, in the first weeks and months of that year, Saint-Nazaire stood at the apex of its operational power, a base full of returning heroes, a flotilla running at full capacity, a campaign that appeared to be working beyond all reasonable expectation. The bunkers were rising steadily over the submarine pens. The repair facilities were expanding, the command staff was confident, and deep in the Atlantic, the boats were hunting. It was the highest point the base would ever reach. From here, the story would become something considerably darker and considerably more honest about the true cost of what was being built at the mouth of the Loire. By the summer of 1941, the waterfront at Saint-Nazaire had ceased to resemble a port town in any conventional sense. Where fishing boats had once tied up and merchant crews had once wandered the quayside, there was now a construction site of almost incomprehensible scale. Cranes rose above the roof lines of the oldest buildings. Concrete mixers ground through the night. The noise was permanent, industrial and relentless, a low mechanical thunder that the surrounding streets had absorbed into the fabric of daily life. The organization told, the German state engineering body, responsible for some of the largest construction projects in occupied Europe, had arrived at Saint-Nazaire with a single directive: build something that could not be destroyed. What followed was one of the most ambitious military engineering programs ever attempted on the Atlantic coast. The fundamental challenge the Germans faced was not complicated to understand, even if solving it was enormously difficult. A submarine pen on the surface was simply a target. Moored boats, fuel stores, torpedo stockpiles, mechanical workshops. Every essential element of a functioning U-boat base was vulnerable to aircraft and to the bombs those aircraft carried. The solution that German engineers proposed was to remove the submarine infrastructure from the surface entirely, not underground, where the water table made excavation impossible, but beneath a ceiling of reinforced concrete so thick, so dense, and so precisely engineered that nothing dropped from altitude could penetrate it. The logic was brute and elegant at once. If you cannot hide the base, you make the base indestructible. The construction began with the excavation of a series of enormous basin chambers, cut directly into the existing harbour infrastructure. The Loire estuary offered a natural tidal range, and German engineers worked that geography into the design, creating enclosed wet docks where submarines could float freely, regardless of the tide. Steel reinforcing rods were driven into the earth in quantities that strained the German supply chain for months. Fresh water, essential for mixing concrete at scale, was diverted from local sources. The labour force working on the pens at the height of construction numbered in the tens of thousands, drawn from across occupied Europe, a mixture of organisation taut, contracted workers, conscripted French labour, and skilled German specialists who coordinated the technical dimensions of the build. The pace was brutal. Shifts ran through the dark hours. Accidents were recorded and largely ignored. The structure rose regardless. What emerged from that effort, slowly, section by section, through the second half of 1941 and into early 1942, was a building that occupied a footprint larger than many cathedrals and possessed a profile more like a geological feature than an architectural one. The U-boat pens at Saint-Nazaire were divided into multiple individual chambers, each large enough to contain a fully equipped ocean-going submarine, with room alongside for maintenance crews, equipment, and support vehicles. The roof was not a single uniform slab, but a layered construction. Steel bars embedded in concrete poured in stages. Each curing before the next was added, creating a composite structure of extraordinary rigidity. The finished ceiling thickness ran to several meters in the critical sections, a number that Allied bombing planners would eventually measure and stare at in disbelief. The internal layout of the pens reflected the operational priorities of the second submarine flotilla with considerable precision. Some bays were configured as dry docks, chambers where the water could be pumped out to allow hull inspections and below waterline repairs. Others were wet berths, kept permanently flooded, allowing submarines to motor in, tie up, and remain sheltered while resupply and rearmament proceeded around them. Narrow internal quays ran along the sides of each bay, allowing torpedo loading equipment to be wheeled directly alongside. Workshop areas were embedded into the rear of the structure, giving mechanics and torpedo technicians covered space to work without exposure to the weather, or, more importantly, to aerial observation. The pens were not simply shelter. They were a self-contained operational environment, the entire rhythm of submarine deployment compressed beneath a single reinforced roof. The ventilation question required particular ingenuity. A submarine running its diesel engines inside an enclosed concrete structure would fill that structure with exhaust in minutes. German engineers installed a system of ducted vents, drawing engine exhaust out through channels built into the walls and roof, allowing U-boat crews to test machinery, run up engines, and carry out pre-departure checks while still inside the pens. The same ventilation logic addressed the atmosphere for workers, who spent entire shifts in spaces lit by electric lighting, strung from the overhead structure, the nearest natural light, sometimes hundreds of meters away, at the pen entrance. The scale of the engineering challenge was compounded at every turn by the need for speed. The submarines were operational. The Battle of the Atlantic was being fought. and the base needed to function even as construction continued around it. Allied planners in Britain became aware of the construction project's full ambition, gradually, rather than at once. Aerial reconnaissance photographs, taken at considerable risk and studied by specialist interpreters, showed the site growing month by month. The dimensions were measurable from altitude, and the thickness of the partially completed roof sections could be estimated from shadow angles and construction staging. What those photographs told the analysts was unwelcome. The standard bomb loads carried by the aircraft currently available to Bomber Command were insufficient to penetrate what was being built. The heaviest bombs in regular use at the time could cause substantial damage to conventional structures, factories, railway yards, residential blocks. Against several meters of reinforced concrete, they were essentially irrelevant. The roof being poured at Saint-Nazaire was, for practical purposes, bomb-proof. This realization forced a significant and uncomfortable revision of Allied strategic assumptions. The working premise through the early period of the war had been that air power could interdict enemy naval infrastructure, that a sustained bombing campaign could degrade the base to the point of operational failure. Saint-Nazaire demolished that premise in concrete. Raids were mounted nonetheless, because other elements of the port remained vulnerable. Fuel storage, the surrounding town's rail connections, the administrative buildings where base personnel lived and worked. The submarines themselves, once inside the pens, were beyond reach. Crews who had crossed the Atlantic under constant threat from aircraft and escorts could pull into Saint-Nazaire and step onto a quayside that no bomb had ever touched. The pens did not merely shelter the U-boats, they provided the psychological anchor for the entire submarine campaign, a place of guaranteed safety in a war that offered very little of it. The effect on German operational planning was immediate and concrete in the most literal sense. Turnaround times for U-boats improved because repairs and resupply could proceed without interruption from air raids. Torpedo stores could be maintained in quantity inside the structure. Engineering teams developed routines that ran with increasing efficiency as the pens filled with the operational and logistical infrastructure of a fully established naval base. Commanders at the 2nd Submarine Flotilla could plan patrol schedules with a confidence grounded in the knowledge that the base itself was secure, whatever was happening at sea. And by late 1941, the Battle of the Atlantic was entering a phase of extraordinary intensity. The shore establishment at Saint-Nazaire was functioning at near-ideal capacity. For the civilian population of Saint-Nazaire and the surrounding region, the pens were a different kind of presence. They dominated the harbour front. They changed the character of the waterfront permanently, replacing the open quaysides and varied commercial infrastructure of a working port with a single overwhelming mass of grey concrete that absorbed light and reflected nothing. The town that had existed before the war could still be found in the streets further inland, but the harbour, the economic and geographic heart of the community, had been transformed into something alien. French workers who had helped build the pens, some voluntarily, many under coercion, lived with the knowledge that their labour had contributed to this transformation. The collaboration of proximity was one of the most corrosive legacies of occupation, and nowhere was it more physically embodied than in those walls. The completion of the pens also closed off one of the most straightforward avenues of Allied strategic response and opened a period of real frustration for British planners and aircrew alike. Bombing runs against Saint-Nazaire would continue for years. But the nature of those operations shifted from targeted strikes against submarine infrastructure to the grim arithmetic of attempting to destroy everything around the pens in the hope of degrading the base's supporting functions. Roads, rail lines, fuel depots, worker accommodation, all of it legitimate, and all of it insufficient as a substitute for the submarines themselves. The concrete had won the first round of that contest decisively, and the Allies knew it. What they would do about it, including the extraordinary raid that was already being planned in the spring of 1942, was a measure of how thoroughly the Pens had changed the strategic problem. The Germans had not merely built a shelter, they had built a problem that bombs alone could not solve. The morning of the 28th of March 1942 broke over the Atlantic with a calm that would soon shatter into violence. In the waters west of Saint-Nazaire, a British naval force cut through the darkness toward the French coast, their engines muffled, their navigation instruments fixed on a single, audacious objective. What was about to unfold would become one of the most daring raids of the entire war, an operation so bold that even its architects could not have predicted its full consequences. The target was not a warship, not an airfield, not a garrison. It was a structure of concrete and steel known as the Normandy Dry Dock, and in the calculus of naval warfare, it had become worth more than a battleship. This dry dock, the largest on the Atlantic coast, was the only facility in all of Nazi-occupied France capable of servicing the German Navy's largest vessels. To the British Admiralty, its destruction represented not merely a tactical blow, but a potential turning point in the Atlantic War. The Germans, meanwhile, believed it invulnerable, surrounded by coastal defenses, protected by anti-aircraft guns, ringed with searchlights and barbed wire. The dry dock seemed an impossible target for any conventional assault. Yet the British had devised something far from conventional. Operation Chariot, as it was designated, would achieve what seemed militarily impossible through a combination of deception, courage, and ruthless precision. The plan itself represented a masterpiece of audacious thinking. At its core lay a single, devastating idea: to convert an obsolete British destroyer, the HMS Campbelltown, into a floating bomb. This elderly four-funneled warship, originally commissioned during the First World War and considered too slow and vulnerable for modern naval combat, would be stripped of most of its weaponry and fitted with tons of explosives deep within its hull. The charges would be fitted with time delay fuses, set to detonate hours after the ship had served its purpose, ensuring that German personnel investigating the vessel would be inside or nearby when the explosion occurred. The Campbelltown would not simply approach the dry dock and announce itself. Instead, it would attempt to penetrate the port of Saint-Nazaire while flying German naval colors, hoping to deceive the coastal batteries and anti-aircraft gunners into holding their fire long enough for the ship to reach its objective. Running alongside and aboard the converted destroyer would be approximately 270 commandos of the British Army and Royal Marines, men trained for precisely this kind of surgical violence. Their task was simultaneously complex and brutal: to land, to destroy the pumping station and the outer caisson doors of the dry dock, to demolish the anti-aircraft defenses, and to create sufficient chaos and destruction to render the facility useless for months. They would accomplish all this against an enemy that would quickly recognize the deception and respond with overwhelming firepower. Every man aboard those ships understood that survival seemed unlikely. The operation would require not merely courage, but a willingness to accept probable death in service of a strategic goal. The British force departed from Falmouth in Cornwall under heavy cloud cover, comprising the converted destroyer, several motor launches carrying commandos, and a small force of minesweepers meant to clear a safe passage through German-controlled waters. The voyage across the Bay of Biscay consumed nearly 2 full days, with the ships maintaining strict radio silence and taking circuitous routes to avoid German patrol aircraft and vessels. As they drew closer to the French coast, The tension aboard each craft became almost palpable. The men of the 2nd Commando Battalion and the Royal Marine Commando had trained for weeks for this assault, studying scale models of Saint-Nazaire, memorizing building layouts, rehearsing their assigned destruction tasks in excruciating detail. Yet no amount of training could truly prepare them for what was about to happen. Some wrote letters home, others cleaned their weapons with ritualistic precision. The Navy men aboard the Campbelltown made final checks of the explosives wired throughout the ship's interior, verifying that the time delay mechanisms would function as designed. The officers briefed their men one final time on the objectives, the rally points, the procedures for withdrawal. But everyone understood that withdrawal, in the conventional sense, would be impossible. The ships would be trapped in the harbor of a heavily defended port. Once German defenses opened fire, escape by sea would become a lethal nightmare. Some of the commandos would be captured, others would be killed in the assault. A fortunate few might reach the motor launches and return to Britain. Most, probably, would not. As darkness fell on the evening of the 28th of March, the British force approached Saint-Nazaire through the narrow channels of the Loire estuary. The tide was high, which was essential. Without sufficient water, the Campbelltown could not reach the dry dock gates. The night was clear, which was unfortunate, as it meant German searchlights could more easily detect the approaching vessels once the deception unraveled. The force commander, Colonel Charles Newman, knew that every minute counted, and that surprise would evaporate the moment German gunners recognized the true nature of the approaching ships. As the Campbelltown and its escort entered the port, its crew raised German naval ensigns. The ruse held, at least briefly. German sentries and coastal gunners, seeing what appeared to be a damaged German destroyer escorted by German minesweepers, did not immediately open fire. The tension stretched across the water like a wire pulled taut. But as the Campbelltown drew closer to the dry dock, someone, whether a vigilant German officer or simply the operation of chance, realized something was fundamentally wrong about the approaching vessel. An order crackled across the German communications network. Anti-aircraft guns burst into flame. Searchlights blazed to life, bathing the approaching British ships in harsh white light. The moment of deception, so carefully orchestrated, lasted only seconds. What followed was pure chaos. Coordinated chaos, perhaps, but chaos nonetheless. The Campbelltown's own guns answered the German fire, even as the destroyer pushed forward at full speed toward the dry dock gates. Tracer fire crossed the harbor in both directions, red and green streaks of light that seemed to paint the sky itself into a vast fabric of violence. The motor launches carrying commandos scattered across the harbor mouth, some maintaining their course toward the designated landing beaches, others taking fire that raked their hulls with machine gun rounds and shrapnel. Men began to die immediately, torn apart by anti-aircraft fire, or drowned when hits sent craft to the bottom. The commandos who survived the passage through the harbor's opening corridors had to navigate not merely incoming fire, but also the chaos of their own arrival. Some boats beached on the stone quays. Others were forced to make makeshift landings, their crews jumping into chest-deep water and wading ashore, while bullets churned up the harbor surface around them. The noise was overwhelming. The roar of diesel engines, the steady hammer of anti-aircraft guns, the sharper crack of rifle and machine gun fire, men shouting orders and warning, the screams of the wounded. The commandos, once ashore, became focused instruments of destruction. Teams moved toward their assigned targets, with the single-minded intensity of men operating on adrenaline and months of rehearsal. Some attacked the anti-aircraft positions, using grenades and concentrated fire to silence the guns that were slaughtering their comrades, still arriving by sea. Others pushed toward the pumping station, a critical facility that controlled the water level within the dry dock itself. Still others moved to place charges on the outer caisson gates, the massive doors that could be opened or closed to admit or exclude the sea. The Campbelltown, meanwhile, had accomplished its primary objective. Despite heavy fire that struck the destroyer repeatedly, killing or wounding many of its crew, the ship drove straight into the dry dock entrance and rammed the massive caisson gates with tremendous force. The impact was violent enough to crack and buckle the gates themselves, but not so violent as to destroy them completely. The destroyer's bow became embedded in the gates, as its momentum carried it forward with relentless momentum. German defenders and port workers crowded onto the quays and surrounding structures, staring at the converted warship that now occupied the entrance to the most important dry dock on the Atlantic coast. What they did not yet understand was that they were looking at a floating bomb. Deep within the Campbelltown's hull, the time delay fuses were running down, counting toward detonation with mechanical inevitability. Officers aboard the destroyer had already abandoned ship, leaving the vessel to its assigned purpose. The commandos themselves had perhaps an hour to accomplish their secondary objectives before the Campbelltown exploded. That hour unfolded as a running battle through the streets and structures of Saint-Nazaire's port area. Teams engaged German defenders in close-quarters combat, using grenades and concentrated small arms fire to clear buildings and establish positions. The pumping station fell to British assault, its vital machinery destroyed by explosives, placed with deliberate precision. The outer caisson doors sustained damage that, while not immediately catastrophic, would require weeks of repair work. Fuel tanks were set ablaze. Supply warehouses were demolished. The commandos fought with a fury, born partly of desperation and partly of the fierce concentration that comes from executing a well-rehearsed plan under conditions of extreme stress. German reinforcements, initially scattered and disorganized, began to coalesce and counterattack. Officers shouted orders. German soldiers emerged from barracks and defensive positions, moving toward the sounds of combat. What had been a raid in the opening moments began to transform into a desperate fight for survival. The commandos, having accomplished most of their assigned objectives, now faced the brutal mathematics of withdrawal. At 0200 hours and approximately 35 minutes after the initial contact, the Campbelltown exploded. The detonation was enormous, a release of energy that seemed to shake the entire harbor. The destroyer's bow section simply disintegrated, taking with it the caisson gates they had rammed, and killing numerous German personnel who had gathered on the surrounding quays to examine the captured vessel. The blast echoed across Saint-Nazaire like the voice of judgment, a massive concussion that knocked men down at considerable distances and set fires burning across the port facility. In the midst of that destruction, the surviving commandos attempted to reach their motor launches for evacuation, but the boats themselves had suffered tremendous casualties during their initial passage into the harbor. Some had been sunk, others were damaged and barely mobile. Still others never made it back to pick up their waiting troops. The withdrawal became a nightmare, men running through streets still under fire, attempting to reach beaches where rescue should have come but often did not. Some commandos were captured, others fought to the last man rather than surrender. The final casualty count would eventually reveal the human cost of Operation Chariot. Roughly 250 men killed, wounded, or missing from the commando force alone, out of fewer than 300 who had entered the port. Many of these losses occurred not during the initial assault, but during the desperate and ultimately failed attempts at withdrawal. Yet from a purely strategic perspective, the operation had succeeded beyond its designer's most optimistic projections. The Normandy dry dock, damaged as it was by the Campbelltown's explosion and the commando assault, would not be restored to full operational capacity until well after the war had ended. For years afterward, The facility sat dormant, its gates destroyed, its pumping mechanisms disabled, its usefulness to the German Navy completely eliminated. This single blow removed the only major facility on the Atlantic coast capable of repairing large German warships, a consequence that would ripple through naval strategy for the remainder of the war. The German heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, which had sustained damage in naval combat, would have to be sent to Germany for repair rather than being serviced at Saint-Nazaire. That diversion of resources and operational capacity represented a victory far exceeding what most military planners would have expected from a single raid. The British public received news of Operation Chariot with jubilation tempered by awareness of the cost. The commandos who returned to Britain, those relatively few survivors of the assault, became heroes in the press and in popular imagination. But the losses were grievous, and the wounded filled military hospitals for months afterward. For the German command, the raid represented a shock that reverberated through the military hierarchy. How had the British managed to penetrate such heavily defended waters? How had they accomplished such precise destruction? The answers lay not in any single factor, but in the combination of meticulous planning, overwhelming courage, and the willingness to accept catastrophic losses as the price of strategic success. Saint-Nazaire had been struck a blow from which it would not fully recover. The Germans would pour additional resources into defending the base, constructing further fortifications and expanding the garrison, but they could never replace the Normandy dry dock, and that loss would constrain their naval operations throughout the remainder of the war. The raid also possessed an intangible but real significance for Allied morale. Throughout 1941 and into 1942, the Axis powers had seemed ascendant, their military forces advancing across multiple theaters with apparent inevitability. The Germans held most of Europe, the Japanese dominated the Pacific, the Soviets were reeling from the initial shock of Operation Barbarossa. In the Atlantic, German U-boats continued to inflict staggering losses on Allied shipping, sinking vessels faster than they could be replaced. Britain itself seemed to be standing alone against overwhelming odds, blockaded by German submarines and under constant threat of invasion. News of Operation Chariot provided something Britain desperately needed: evidence that the Allies could strike back, that German fortresses could be breached, that even heavily defended positions could be overcome through courage and innovation. The raid became a symbol of British determination and tactical ingenuity, a reminder that victory was not inevitable for the Axis, and that the vast industrial and military might, a raid against Germany, would not be exhausted by mere distance and defensive fortifications. Saint-Nazaire would continue to operate as a U-boat base for another 3 years, but it would do so under the shroud of that March night in 1942, when British commandos and sailors had reached into the heart of German-occupied France and struck a blow that the German Navy would never fully repair. In the grey hours after dawn on the 28th of March 1942, the smoke that rose from Saint-Nazaire's harbour carried with it something more than ash and burning metal. The old destroyer HMS Campbelltown rammed deep into the gates of the former Cluse, the massive dry dock that had become the lifeblood of German naval repair operations on the Atlantic coast, lay listing and broken, her hull already beginning to settle into the mud. Around her, commandos of the 2nd Battalion, Royal Engineers, moved through the carnage with grim purpose, planting explosives in boiler rooms, generator stations, and along the intricate machinery that formed the dock's control systems. The raid, codenamed Operation Chariot, had achieved what months of bombing campaigns could not. For all the RAF's sustained pressure on the port, for all the tonnage of ordnance dropped from high altitude, it had taken a single calculated act of naval audacity to strike a blow that would fundamentally alter the strategic equation in the Atlantic. The Formecluse was not merely a dry dock. It was Germany's only facility on the entire Atlantic seaboard, capable of refloating and repairing capital ships. The heavy cruisers, battleships, and battle cruisers that formed the backbone of German surface naval power. When the Deutschland-class raider Admiral Scheer had been damaged by British naval forces and required extensive reconstruction, Saint-Nazaire had been the port where that work was undertaken. The Tirpitz, the formidable sister ship of the Bismarck, had used these facilities for her own maintenance. Any future German surface operation in the Atlantic now faced a terrifying constraint. Without the ability to repair significant damage at Saint-Nazaire, a wounded capital ship would be forced to limp back to German ports in the North Sea, leaving exposed supply lines and reducing operational reach. The Admiralstab, the German Naval High Command in Berlin, suddenly understood that the threat to their remaining surface vessels had multiplied exponentially. The dry dock, once a symbol of German mastery in occupied France, had become a liability that could no longer be reliably defended. The human cost of the raid had been extraordinary. Of the 620 commandos who had set out on this desperate enterprise, more than 400 had been killed, wounded, or captured. The beaches around Saint-Nazaire were littered with the bodies of men who had expected to fight their way inland, secure the objectives, and be evacuated by motor torpedo boats that never arrived. The gunboat Campbelltown herself, packed with delayed action explosives, had sailed toward the dock gates with her decks swept by machine gun fire, her crew and attached army personnel enduring devastating casualties as they approached their target. Those who survived to plant charges in the power stations and lock gates knew, with a clarity born of military training and grim realism, that many of their comrades would not be returning. Yet the scale of sacrifice had been weighed against strategic necessity, and the British High Command had determined that the price was worth the objective. When the delayed charges detonated hours later, the Campbelltown's explosives tearing through the dry dock's gates with a force that shook the entire harbour, the calculation proved correct. News of the raid spread through occupied France like an electrical current, jumping from whispered conversations in cafes to coded radio broadcasts from the BBC, from intelligence summaries passed between British and American commands to the desks of German officers struggling to comprehend how such an audacious operation had penetrated their defences. The Allies had announced the raid publicly, turning the tactical victory into a propaganda triumph. Here was proof that the initiative did not lie exclusively with the Axis powers, that British forces could strike deep into occupied territory and achieve objectives against a fortified position. For the French population enduring 4 years of occupation, the raid represented something more than military success. It was evidence of hope, of the possibility that the Nazi occupation would not continue indefinitely. The morale boost that rippled through the Free French movement and the underground resistance networks across France could not be quantified in casualty reports or tonnage sunk, but it was real and it was profound. In Berlin and in the fortified command posts of the Atlantic Wall that was already beginning to take shape, German military leaders confronted a new reality. Saint-Nazaire was no longer secure. The raid had demonstrated that British Combined Operations Forces possessed both the intelligence capability to identify critical vulnerabilities and the audacity to exploit them, regardless of cost. More immediately pressing was the question of what this meant for German naval strategy. The Tirpitz, then stationed in Norwegian waters, could not be moved south to the Atlantic with any confidence that she could be repaired if seriously damaged. The heavy cruisers that had operated from Atlantic ports would require even more careful handling. German surface naval operations, already constrained by Allied air and naval superiority, now faced a new dimension of risk. The psychological impact in the German naval officer corps was significant. The port that had been presented to them as a fortress, as an impregnable base for German operations, had been penetrated by a force less than 1/10 its garrison strength. The German response was swift and unmeasured. Dönitz, the commander of the U-boat arm, understood better than anyone the critical importance of maintaining Saint-Nazaire as an operational facility, but he was determined that such an incursion would not be repeated. Orders went out to reinforce the garrison, to extend the coastal defenses, and to establish multiple layers of security, both waterborne and on land. The Germans began construction of additional flak towers, anti-aircraft emplacements bristling with cannons and machine guns, designed to fill the sky above the harbour with such a density of fire that no motor torpedo boat could approach the inner harbour again. Machine gun nests were positioned along the quays and the approaches to the dock. German engineers, working with conscripted French labourers, expanded the already formidable concrete bunkers that protected the submarine pens, adding new layers of reinforcement and creating overlapping fields of fire from defensive positions. The raid, in this sense, had provoked not a retreat but a hardening, a transformation of the base into something even more defensible than before. Yet this very impulse to reinforce also revealed an anxious awareness among German commanders. If Saint-Nazaire could be attacked once, what prevented it from being attacked again? The British had shown that they possessed the operational capability, the intelligence, and the willingness to accept significant casualties to achieve strategic objectives. German High Command issued new directives requiring constant alertness, establishing protocols for rapid response to infiltrations or diversions, and demanding that the base be maintained at a state of semi-permanent combat readiness. The psychological burden of this unending vigilance fell heaviest on the garrison personnel and the civilian workers who remained at the port. German soldiers who had expected their posting to Saint-Nazaire to be a relatively secure assignment now found themselves part of a fortress garrison under permanent siege, even in the absence of visible enemy forces. The destruction of the dry dock itself presented immediate logistical problems. The repair capability that had been central to German naval operations on the Atlantic coast had to be compensated for through other means. Damaged submarines and smaller patrol vessels now faced extended journeys back to German yards or to ports in occupied Norway and Denmark. The delay in repairs translated directly into reduced operational capacity. Boats that could have been returned to patrol within weeks now required months of work in distant facilities. German submarine commanders understood the implications immediately. The wolf packs that had operated with such devastating effectiveness against Atlantic convoys in 1941 and the early months of 1942 were now operating under new constraints. A U-boat damaged by a depth charge attack could no longer limp into Saint-Nazaire for rapid repairs. The base remained valuable for provisioning and refueling, but its status as a premier repair facility had been erased in the space of a few hours. The British government, recognizing the strategic significance of what had been achieved, moved quickly to publicize the raid and the sacrifice involved. Winston Churchill himself noted the operation in his war memoirs, describing it as an example of the kind of audacious thinking and willingness to accept casualties that distinguished the British war effort. The detailed after-action reports were circulated through American military channels as well. The United States, now 4 months into its own war following the attack on Pearl Harbor, observed with interest how the British combined naval innovation, surprise, and ground forces to achieve objectives that air power alone could not accomplish. Operation Chariot became a template, a demonstration of what combined operations could achieve when properly planned and executed with sufficient force and willingness to accept casualties. The immediate aftermath of the raid saw frantic activity in the captured fortress. German engineers assessed the full extent of damage to the dock's machinery and structural integrity. The gates themselves, the massive structures that could be closed to allow the water level to be lowered so that ship repairs could be conducted in the dry, had been blown inward with tremendous force. The mechanisms that operated these gates had been destroyed. The power plant that supplied electricity to the dock's vast array of pumps, motors, and work lights had been extensively damaged. German technical assessments concluded that rebuilding the facility to operational status would require months of work, possibly longer, given the constraints of wartime supply and the ongoing demands for resources elsewhere in the German military machine. Even with the most optimistic projections, the Four-Meclus would not be capable of receiving large vessels for some considerable time. This realization prompted heated debates within German naval planning circles. Some officers advocated for immediate reconstruction of the facility as a matter of strategic necessity. Others, more pragmatically, noted that the resources required for such reconstruction might be better employed elsewhere, particularly given that Saint-Nazaire itself was now clearly vulnerable to further attack. The dry dock, one of the most heavily protected installations within the port's defensive perimeter, had been penetrated and destroyed, despite German awareness of the threat. What guarantee existed that it could be adequately defended going forward? The raid had introduced an element of doubt into German calculations, a recognition that even formidable fortifications and alert garrisons could be overcome by an opponent willing to accept sufficient casualties to achieve the objective. This psychological shift, more than the physical damage to the facility, would influence German strategic decisions in the months and years to come. For the Allies, the raid represented more than a military victory. It was a statement of capability and intent. The strategic bombing campaign against French ports had delivered pressure, but not the kind of knockout blow that air power alone could provide. The commando raid, by contrast, had achieved in a single night what weeks of bombing had not: the destruction of a facility critical to German operations. The lesson would not be lost on Allied planners. As the war progressed, and British and American forces began planning for the eventual invasion of occupied Europe, the demonstrated success of combined operations, the integration of air support, naval forces, and ground troops in a coordinated assault, would inform the overall strategy. The raid on Saint-Nazaire, though tactically small in the scale of the broader war, had strategic implications that extended far beyond the Loire estuary. It proved that German fortifications, however formidable, could be breached. It demonstrated that calculated risk and audacious thinking could achieve results that overwhelming force could not. And it showed the French population that their liberation was not merely a distant possibility, but something that required and deserved their support and hope. By 1942, the German fortress at Saint-Nazaire had become more than a submarine base. It was a strategic prize, so valuable that the Allies could no longer ignore it, no matter the cost. The dry dock had been destroyed by Operation Chariot in March, yet the U-boats continued to operate from the pens. The concrete bunkers that had seemed so impregnable after their completion were now about to face their first true test. The Royal Air Force would soon transform Saint-Nazaire into one of the most heavily bombed sites on the Atlantic coast. What followed was not a brief campaign of isolated raids, but a sustained, grinding offensive that would last until the final collapse of Nazi Germany. The skies above the Loire estuary would become a battlefield as deadly in its own way as any fort on land. The British planning for the bombing campaign began almost immediately after Operation Chariot. Intelligence reports detailed the exact dimensions of the U-boat pens, their concrete thickness, and their weaknesses. RAF strategists knew that conventional bombs dropped from altitude could not penetrate the massive reinforced roofs that protected the submarines. They would need to strike at everything else: the repair facilities, the fuel storage, the accommodation blocks, the supply warehouses, and the infrastructure that kept the base functioning as an operational command post. The approach was born partly from necessity and partly from the understanding that even fortified bunkers cannot sustain an operation if everything around them lies in ruins. The Allies would not crack the fortress through direct assault. Instead, they would slowly strangle it. The first large-scale raid came in autumn of 1942. Lancaster and Wellington bombers, escorted by fighters, approached Saint-Nazaire under cover of darkness or poor weather. Their bomb loads were substantial, and the accuracy of Pathfinder navigation, a new technique using radio beams to mark targets, was improving steadily. The flak defenses around the port were formidable. 88mm anti-aircraft guns had been installed throughout the base, and their crews were well trained and vigilant. Yet German air defense was stretched thin across occupied France, and often the bombers arrived with insufficient fighter protection to intercept them. The crews who flew these missions knew that Saint-Nazaire was heavily defended. Many of them would not return. What the bombing revealed almost immediately was an uncomfortable truth for the German High Command. The concrete pens, built at such enormous expense and with such engineering precision, worked exactly as designed. Direct hits on the bunker roofs caused some damage but rarely penetrated to the submarines sheltering within. A U-boat inside one of the massive pens during a raid was safer than a soldier in a field fortification. The Germans had solved one problem brilliantly, but in doing so had created another. By making the submarines nearly invulnerable to air attack, they had forced the Allies to destroy everything else. The bombardment would have to be massive, sustained, and comprehensive. The scale of the campaign escalated throughout late 1942 and into 1943. Bomber Command deployed increasing numbers of heavy aircraft. By 1943, raids on Saint-Nazaire often involved more than 100 bombers in a single night attack. Some days, additional raids would come during daylight hours. The port and its surrounding areas became obscured by smoke and dust, so thick that pilots from later waves could barely see their target markers. The warehouses that stored supplies burned with intense heat. The repair shops, where damaged U-boats were restored to operational condition, were reduced to rubble and twisted metal. The accommodation blocks, where German personnel and conscripted French workers lived, became targets that the Allies struck with grim calculation. German soldiers and French civilians died together in the destruction. The civilian cost of the campaign remains difficult to quantify precisely. Saint-Nazaire was a working port town, and tens of thousands of civilians lived in the surrounding urban area. Many worked in the port facilities or nearby industrial sites. Others were simply trapped in a location that had become too dangerous to leave, but too strategically important for the Allies to spare. As the bombing intensified, civilian casualties mounted steadily. Entire neighborhoods were obliterated by single raids. Underground shelters saved some lives, but direct hits and the collapse of buildings took others. The population of Saint-Nazaire was ordered to remain in place by German military authorities, who needed the civilian workforce to maintain port operations. Those who attempted to evacuate faced harsh punishment. The town became a trap where civilians and combatants suffered alike. The German response to the bombing campaign was both defensive and defiant. Anti-aircraft defenses were strengthened continuously. Additional 88mm guns were positioned around the port, along with lighter caliber flak weapons. Searchlight batteries were expanded to illuminate attacking bombers for the anti-aircraft gunners and defending fighters. Yet these defenses, however formidable they appeared, could not stop the sustained assault. The RAF continued to lose aircraft. The cost of the campaign in lost bombers and crew members was never inconsequential, but losses in German fighters and anti-aircraft ammunition were equally severe. The mathematics of attrition favored the Allies, who had vast industrial capacity and could replace losses indefinitely. Germany could not. The strategic purpose of the bombing campaign extended beyond simple destruction. Each raid reinforced the reality that Saint-Nazaire, despite its massive fortifications, was no longer a safe base from which to launch submarine operations. U-boats spent more time undergoing repair and less time on active patrol. Supply shortages became more acute as warehouses burned and the capacity to unload cargo from supply ships diminished. Morale among the German garrison began to crack. The constant threat from the air, the knowledge that the next alarm siren could bring another devastating raid, and the visible destruction all around created a sense that the fortress was becoming more of a tomb than a fighting base. New U-boats still arrived for deployment, but experienced captains knew they were sailing out from an increasingly degraded facility. Replacements and repairs were becoming unreliable. The impact on U-boat operations was measurable and cumulative. Submarines that in 1942 would have received 6 weeks of maintenance and resupply in Saint-Nazaire were now receiving 3 weeks, with work left incomplete. Crews suffered from exhaustion and stress. The loading of fresh supplies was rushed and sometimes chaotic. The forward momentum that had characterized German submarine operations was now being lost to the simple friction of logistics and damage. Each month that passed saw fewer submarines departing Saint-Nazaire for Atlantic operations. This did not happen because the U-boats were being destroyed in the pens by bombing. They were protected against that. It happened because the infrastructure supporting submarine operations was being systematically dismantled. The Allies had found the answer to the concrete bunkers. They would simply blow up everything else. Yet for all the damage inflicted and the disruption caused, the most remarkable aspect of the bombing campaign was how it failed to achieve complete victory. The U-boats continued to operate from Saint-Nazaire even as the war turned decisively against Germany. The pens, their massive concrete roofs unmarked and unblemished, continued to shelter submarines that would venture out into the Atlantic. The psychological effect of continuous bombing was significant, but it did not break German resolve or lead to abandonment of the base. Instead, the fortress mentality deepened. German commanders at Saint-Nazaire became more rigidly attached to defending the base, more convinced that holding this particular piece of French territory was important to the Nazi cause. The reality was that Saint-Nazaire had become less valuable as a practical naval facility with each passing month. Yet it had simultaneously become more important as a symbol of German refusal to yield ground. The British and American bomber crews who struck at Saint-Nazaire paid their own terrible price for the campaign. The base's anti-aircraft defenses claimed dozens of aircraft. Some bombers were shot down on the approach, others on the way home after releasing their loads. Experienced crews and newly trained aircrew died together in blazing fuselages falling from the night sky. The casualty rate among bomber crews was grim enough that it never became a matter of public celebration, even as the damage inflicted on Saint-Nazaire was reported as a victory in the press. The men flying these missions understood that they were engaged in a grinding campaign of mutual attrition. They were willing to accept the losses because they believed the mission mattered. They were right. By the end of 1943, Saint-Nazaire was no longer the thriving submarine base. It had been at the height of German naval ascendancy. The physical plant was damaged, The strategic position was weakening, and the balance of the war at sea was shifting decisively against the U-boat arm. Yet the fortress remained. The concrete bunkers still stood, their roofs still unmarked by the bombs that rained down upon everything around them. The Germans would continue to defend Saint-Nazaire with stubborn determination, even as the war moved beyond them. The bombing campaign had not destroyed the base, but it had transformed it from a base of operations into something far more fragile, a position that had to be held for reasons of pride and ideology rather than military necessity. The concrete bunkers had proven their worth, but the campaign around them revealed a deeper truth. Sometimes defeating a fortress does not require breaching its walls. Sometimes it requires patience, overwhelming force, and the willingness to destroy everything that makes the fortress matter. By the spring of 1943, the Atlantic had changed. The waters that had belonged to the U-boat arm for nearly 3 years, waters where German submarines moved with near impunity, where merchant convoys fell before wolf-pack assaults like wheat before a scythe, had become contested ground. The men who commanded Saint-Nazaire, who walked the concrete corridors of the flotilla headquarters and studied the operational maps showing patrol zones and rendezvous points, began to notice it first in the patrol reports. The sinkings that had come so easily, so predictably, now demanded greater sacrifice. The U-boats that departed the slate-grey waters of the Loire estuary with full magazines and the confidence of years of success now returned, if they returned at all, with empty tubes, damaged hulls, and crews bearing witness to a new and terrifying reality. The Germans had built their Atlantic fortress on the assumption that numerical advantage and tactical cunning would sustain their submarine war indefinitely. By mid-1943, that assumption was collapsing. The transformation began with technology, that relentless engine of military change. The Allies, mobilizing the vast industrial capacity of Britain and America with methodical precision, had begun deploying improved depth charges, explosive devices that sank deeper, detonated more reliably, and packed greater destructive force than the early models that U-boats had learned to evade. These new charges forced submarines into deeper water to escape, but deeper water brought its own dangers. Hull stress, reduced mobility, and greater vulnerability to the acoustic detection equipment that Allied escorts were now installing on frigates and corvettes. The sound-ranging apparatus, refined through months of operational experience and technical innovation, could locate a diving U-boat with terrifying accuracy. What had once been a refuge, the murky depths of the Atlantic, had become a trap. Submariners spoke of hearing the distinctive ping of the detection equipment and knowing that their position was marked, that the hunters circling above had a true bearing on their location. More devastating still was the arrival of the escort carrier. These small, converted merchant ships, equipped with a handful of anti-submarine aircraft, represented a fundamental shift in naval architecture and tactical doctrine. They were not powerful warships by conventional standards, lacking the firepower of destroyers or cruisers, but they could project air power across hundreds of kilometers of ocean. The aircraft they carried, sturdy, unglamorous patrol bombers, could locate a U-boat on the surface through sheer range and persistence. When a submarine was spotted, the aircraft could attack with bombs and depth charges before the boat could dive beyond effective bombing depth. This combination of detection and air assault created a nightmare scenario for submariners accustomed to operating with relative freedom on the surface. The U-boat arm, which had built its entire operational doctrine around the submarine's ability to recharge batteries on the surface at night, while remaining invisible in darkness, now faced the possibility of being hunted both above and below the waves, neither element offering safety. The intelligence dimension of this transformation was equally profound, though largely invisible to the men commanding Saint-Nazaire until they saw its effects in their patrol reports. The Allies had broken German naval codes with increasing consistency, not completely, not perfectly, but well enough to know roughly where convoy routes ran and where U-boats congregated. This meant that when a wolf pack assembled to strike a convoy, the Allied commanders often knew approximately where and when the attack would occur. Convoy routes could be rerouted to avoid the waiting U-boats, or escorting warships could be positioned to intercept the attackers. The element of surprise, that German tactical advantage that had yielded such rich results in 1940 and 1941, had been systematically stripped away. Captains who departed Saint-Nazaire, expecting to find merchant vessels undefended and unaware, instead encountered heavily escorted convoys, deployed with precision into positions of advantage. The technological and intelligence dominance that Germany had possessed for years was being methodically eroded, yet perhaps the most psychologically damaging shift was the simple matter of convoy strength. By 1943, the Allies were deploying escort groups of unprecedented size and composition. A typical Atlantic convoy no longer consisted of a handful of armed trawlers or elderly destroyers struggling to protect dozens of merchant ships. Instead, convoys now moved under the protection of multiple destroyers, corvettes, frigates, and armed escorts, equipped with the latest detection gear and trained in advanced anti-submarine tactics. The ratio had reversed. Where once a U-boat might encounter 3 or 4 escorts protecting 50 merchant ships, now the same number of U-boats faced a barrier of 10 to 12 well-armed, coordinated warships, each equipped with radar and sonar, each commanding crews that had learned through bitter experience how to hunt submarines effectively. Attacking such a convoy, even with a full wolf pack, had become a proposition of diminishing returns. The U-boats that attacked often suffered damage or destruction themselves, and even successful attacks now typically resulted in the sinking of only 1 or 2 merchant vessels before the escorts forced the submarines to break off and dive to avoid mutual destruction. The cumulative effect of these changes manifested itself in the casualty lists that arrived at Saint-Nazaire with increasing frequency. In 1940 and 1941, U-boat losses, measured in the dozens per year, had been acceptable. They were replaced by new construction, and the overall inventory of operational submarines continued to grow. By 1943, the losses had mounted to terrifying levels. 50 U-boats in 1 month, 60 in another, 70 at the peak of the crisis. In May of that year, when the wolf packs received devastating maulings, trying to attack successive convoys in the central Atlantic. These losses represented not merely ships and tonnage, they represented entire crews, 100 men or more per boat, many of them skilled submariners that Germany could not easily replace. The training pipeline for new crews could not keep pace with the attrition rate. Experienced men were being ground down faster than they could be replenished. The operational tempo at Saint-Nazaire began visibly to decline. The port, which had bustled with activity in 1942, U-boats constantly arriving for refit, departing for patrol, receiving supplies and ammunition, became increasingly congested and chaotic. The damage from the commando raid on the dry dock had eliminated the facility's ability to repair large warships, and the continuous bombing campaigns had damaged other infrastructure vital to sustained operations. But more than physical damage, a deeper malaise was spreading. Submarine captains who had once competed for patrol assignments in the Atlantic now heard rumors of what awaited them: enhanced escort strength, improved weapons for the escorts, aircraft operating from carriers, acoustic torpedoes that could hear a diving U-boat, and pursue it into the depths. The confidence that had sustained the U-boat arm, the sense that technical superiority and tactical cunning would always find a way to strike at the Allies, was giving way to a grim awareness that the operational environment was fundamentally changing against them. The command structure at Saint-Nazaire and the broader U-boat arm leadership faced an increasingly bitter strategic reality. The admirals in Berlin insisted that the U-boat war remained winnable, that new technology under development would restore the decisive advantage. But the men in the flotilla headquarters, reviewing operational reports and casualty lists, understood that something had fundamentally shifted. They were no longer the hunters. They were being hunted. The submarine captains themselves, drawn from a generation of talented and aggressive officers, began to speak privately of suicide missions. Patrols that had once promised rich hunting grounds now offered only the prospect of running a gauntlet of escorts and aircraft to reach a convoy. And then, after a brief attack, the frantic dive to escape destruction. The mathematics of the Atlantic campaign had become brutally unfavorable. A U-boat might sink 2 or 3 merchant vessels, representing perhaps 20,000 tons of cargo and supplies, before being forced to break off and run. But the cost, expending fuel, torpedoes, and crew expertise in the attempt, increasingly outweighed the benefit. The port itself began to acquire the character of a fortress under siege. The concrete bunkers, which had been viewed as offensive bases from which to project power across the Atlantic, increasingly began to feel like shelters from an overwhelming air assault. The bombing campaigns that had begun in 1942 intensified through 1943, with RAF bomber squadrons returning again and again to pound the remaining infrastructure of Saint-Nazaire. The massive concrete U-boat pens protected the submarines themselves. A bomb could impact the thick roof and fail to penetrate, but everything around them suffered. The fuel storage facilities, the ammunition magazines, the repair shops, the barracks for the crews, the administrative buildings, these were progressively damaged or destroyed. Supply shortages began to plague the base. Replacement parts became harder to obtain. Fresh provisions, never abundant in occupied France, became scarcer as the German military situation deteriorated across Europe. The men stationed at Saint-Nazaire began to experience a sense of disconnection from the larger war, as if they were maintaining a fortress in a besieged island, cut off from the German heartland, uncertain of what victory might look like, or how long the supply situation could be sustained. The strategic purpose of Saint-Nazaire itself was being called into question by the shifting balance at sea. The base had been built and maintained at enormous cost, concrete poured, bunkers excavated, infrastructure developed, because German admirals believed that submarines operating from French Atlantic ports could wage a war of attrition against Allied shipping. But if U-boats could no longer reliably find and sink merchant vessels in sufficient quantities to affect the overall military balance, then the base was merely consuming resources needed elsewhere. Some strategists began to argue that the U-boat arm should retreat to the North Sea and closer to German-controlled waters, abandoning the long patrols across the Atlantic. But such discussions remained largely theoretical. The bunkers of Saint-Nazaire represented such an enormous investment in industrial capacity and resources that abandoning them felt, to German commanders, like an admission of defeat. So the base continued to operate, to send U-boats into increasingly hostile waters, to receive the damaged and depleted boats that managed to limp home, even as the operational calculus deteriorated month by month. By late 1943, Saint-Nazaire had transitioned from being an advanced base of offensive naval operations to something more akin to a fortress under siege, a position to be held, defended, and sustained through concentrated effort and sacrifice, rather than a springboard from which to project power. The U-boats that departed the port still carried the hopes and expectations of their captains and crews, and some still achieved successes against merchant shipping or escort vessels. But these successes came at ever higher cost, and they no longer produced the strategic results that had justified the submarine campaign in the first place. The balance in the Atlantic, once favorable to Germany, had shifted decisively toward the Allies. The fortress remained formidable, its concrete walls capable of withstanding sustained bombing, its harbor still capable of sheltering submarines and conducting repairs. But it was a fortress that was slowly being strangled, cut off from adequate supply, increasingly isolated as the broader German position in Europe deteriorated, forced to undertake ever more desperate missions in waters where the enemy now held a decisive technological and tactical advantage. The greatest challenge facing Saint-Nazaire in the months ahead would not be how to continue the aggressive submarine offensive that had given birth to the base, but how to endure under conditions of siege and deprivation that had no clear resolution. Beneath the shroud of German military authority, Saint-Nazaire harbored a different kind of war, one fought in the darkness of occupied France, where civilians became agents and factories became targets. The U-boat base, for all its concrete fortifications and armed guards, could not seal itself off from the French population that surrounded it. The port town and its hinterland remained fundamentally French, inhabited by people whose loyalty to Nazi occupation was far from unanimous. Resistance cells, drawn from workers, intellectuals, former soldiers, and ordinary citizens, began to organize in the months following the German arrival. They understood that the submarine base represented not merely a military installation, but the machinery of German domination in the Atlantic. To strike at Saint-Nazaire was to strike at Hitler's war itself. The resistance around Saint-Nazaire took many forms, each reflecting the constraints and possibilities of occupied territory under German military control. Factory workers inside the port facilities became living intelligence networks, passing information about U-boat movements, repair schedules, and the arrival of new vessels through carefully constructed chains of communication. Bicycle messengers carried coded messages to safe houses scattered through the town and surrounding villages. Resistance photographed German documents when opportunity allowed, smuggled technical specifications out of the base, and reported on the movements of senior officers and naval personnel. This intelligence work was painstaking and dangerous. A single careless word overheard by a collaborator, a message intercepted by German security forces, could unravel an entire cell and send its members to interrogation, imprisonment, or execution. The scale of German military presence made Saint-Nazaire one of the most heavily garrisoned towns in occupied France. Thousands of soldiers and naval personnel were stationed in and around the port, housed in barracks, requisitioned buildings, and hastily constructed quarters. This concentration of military power created both opportunity and peril for the resistance. The very density of German forces meant that sabotage or attack could be met with overwhelming retaliation, yet it also meant that a network of resistance activists could potentially inflict damage on the U-boat arm while remaining concealed within the general population. The resistance faced a constant calculus. How much action could be undertaken without triggering German reprisals so severe that the population would turn against them, or that entire communities would be destroyed in response? Sabotage represented one of the resistance's most potent weapons, though its execution required exceptional courage and meticulous planning. Workers within the U-boat pens and repair facilities could introduce subtle defects into machinery, damage electrical systems in ways that might not be immediately obvious, or delay critical repairs through bureaucratic manipulation and work slowdowns, a bearing installed incorrectly, a fuel line partially severed, a timing mechanism adjusted by a fraction of a millimeter. Such sabotage might cause a U-boat to develop problems only when it was far out to sea, far from any hope of rescue. The British Naval Intelligence Service eventually established contact with French resistance cells around Saint-Nazaire, providing them with guidance on how to conduct sabotage that would prove most effective against submarine operations. These instructions emphasized methods that would be difficult to detect but catastrophic in their consequences. Some resistance activities took the form of direct attack, though these were rarer and more costly than the slow work of intelligence gathering and industrial sabotage. In 1943, resistance members attempted to assassinate a senior U-boat commander at a social gathering in Saint-Nazaire. The operation failed, the attacker was captured, and German reprisals followed swiftly. Entire blocks of the town were sealed off as German security forces conducted mass arrests of suspected resistance sympathizers. Dozens of innocent civilians were detained, interrogated, and some were executed in response to the attack. These reprisals created a terrible tension within the resistance movement. Aggressive action against German targets often resulted in German punishment of the civilian population, creating moral and strategic dilemmas that had no easy resolution. The relationship between the resistance and the general population of Saint-Nazaire was complex and sometimes fraught with contradiction. Many ordinary citizens despised the German occupation and harbored sympathies for the resistance, providing safe houses, food, and information. Yet the same population also included collaborators, French citizens who actively cooperated with German authorities, either from ideological conviction or from practical calculation that collaboration offered safety and advantage. The Gestapo and German security forces actively cultivated informants among the French population, offering money, protection, and preferential treatment to those willing to report on resistance activity. Families were sometimes divided, with one member actively resisting while another served as an informant. Trust became precious and dangerous. A resistance cell might be betrayed by someone they had known for years, someone whose face was familiar and whose motives seemed clear, until the moment of betrayal revealed them as something else entirely. German counterintelligence operations around Saint-Nazaire were systematic and ruthless. The Gestapo, the Wehrmacht security services, and German police forces maintained networks of informants and conducted regular sweeps of suspected resistance strongholds. Interrogation centers were established in the town where suspects were held and questioned. The methods employed were brutal, designed to break resistance and extract information about cell structures, safe houses, and the identities of other members. Some resistance survived interrogation and were eventually executed. Others disappeared into the German prison system, their fates unknown to their families and comrades. The psychological terror created by the threat of arrest and interrogation was itself a form of weapon wielded by the occupation authorities, creating an atmosphere of fear that suppressed overt resistance activity. Yet despite the dangers and the overwhelming German military power, the resistance persisted and even grew as the war progressed. By 1944, as German military fortunes declined, more French citizens began to believe that Nazi defeat was possible and began to shift their calculations. A resistance membership that might have seemed suicidal in 1942 began to seem like prudent preparation for a post-occupation France. Young men and women joined resistance networks in increasing numbers. Supplies of weapons and equipment began to arrive from Britain by parachute drops and covert missions. British liaison officers were infiltrated into France to coordinate resistance activity with Allied military planning. Saint-Nazaire and its surrounding region became increasingly active as a center of resistance organization. The intelligence gathered by French resistance cells around Saint-Nazaire eventually flowed to London and became integrated into British military planning. Information about the completion of the massive U-boat pens confirmed what aerial reconnaissance had already suggested, that concrete fortifications had made conventional bombing attacks largely ineffective. This intelligence informed the British decision to launch Operation Chariot, the desperate commando raid on the dry dock that would ultimately prove far more damaging to German naval operations than any bombing campaign could achieve. The resistance also provided detailed maps of the port facilities, information about guard rotations and patrol patterns, and assessments of German military strength that helped the British plan and execute the raid. Collaboration and resistance existed side by side in Saint-Nazaire, creating a profoundly unsettled occupied society. Some French administrators cooperated with German authorities in maintaining order and extracting resources for the German war effort. French police forces, nominally under German command, sometimes facilitated resistance activities while outwardly performing their duties. French railway workers slowed the movement of military supplies when possible, while appearing to work within the German system. This was not a simple division between those who resisted and those who collaborated, but rather a complex spectrum of choices, compromises, and calculations made by individuals and communities facing an overwhelming occupying power. The resistance understood that French society could not be purely purified of collaboration. Survival sometimes required compromise, and absolute moral purity was often the luxury of those with no power. As the war turned decisively against Germany and Allied forces approached France, the resistance around Saint-Nazaire became increasingly bold. The port remained a vital German military asset, even as the strategic situation deteriorated, and attacks on it took on greater significance. The resistance conducted more frequent sabotage operations, more aggressive intelligence gathering, and more direct assaults on German personnel and infrastructure. German security forces responded with increased violence and attempts to crush the resistance through mass arrests and executions. The cycle of attack and reprisal accelerated, turning Saint-Nazaire into an increasingly dangerous place for both German occupiers and French resistance. The underground war around Saint-Nazaire illustrated a fundamental truth about modern occupation. No military fortification, no matter how massive or well-engineered, could completely isolate an occupying force from the population it sought to control. The U-boat base, protected by concrete bunkers and armed guards, remained embedded within French society and therefore vulnerable to French resistance. The psychological and military impact of resistance activity was significant, though difficult to measure. Sabotage inside the base delayed repairs and damaged submarines. Intelligence gathered by resistance members contributed to Allied military planning. Even failed resistance attacks and their subsequent German reprisals created friction and consumed German resources that might have been deployed elsewhere. The resistance transformed Saint-Nazaire from merely a military objective on a map into a contested space where German occupation was constantly challenged and questioned. By 1944, the underground war had become inseparable from the conventional military war raging across Europe. The advance of Allied armies toward France meant that resistance activity shifted from isolated acts of defiance to coordinated military operations that supported the liberation of occupied territory. Saint-Nazaire and its surrounding region were identified as areas where resistance forces could harass German military movements, attack supply lines, and prepare the ground for the final expulsion of the occupation. The resistance, which had operated in darkness and secrecy for 4 years, began to emerge into the daylight of declared warfare. The fortress base that had seemed so impregnable in 1942 now faced threats not merely from above, in the form of bombing aircraft, but from within and around it, from the French population that had never truly accepted German rule. This complex occupation, military on the surface, but always contested beneath, revealed the limits of power based purely on force and the enduring capacity of populations to resist, even when the immediate prospects for liberation seemed distant and unlikely. By 1943, the Atlantic had become a graveyard for German submarines. The U-boat, once the terror of Allied shipping, was now the hunted rather than the hunter. Improved radar systems on Allied escort vessels, better depth charge patterns, and the sheer numerical superiority of the growing American and British fleets had transformed the underwater war into a grinding attrition that Germany could no longer win. At Saint-Nazaire, the commanders of the Second Submarine Flotilla faced an uncomfortable truth. The boats that had delivered such stunning victories in the happy time were no longer fit for purpose. Their speed was inadequate, their endurance was declining, and worst of all, they required an average of 8 to 10 days on the surface to recharge batteries, making them vulnerable to detection. Something had to change. The German High Command knew it, Admiral Dönitz knew it, and the designers at the Blohm and Voss shipyards in Hamburg knew it. If Germany was to maintain any hope of disrupting Allied supply lines before the combined weight of American and British power crushed the Third Reich entirely, a new generation of submarines would have to emerge from the drawing boards and into operational service. That new generation was the Type 21. The Type 21 represented a revolutionary departure from everything that had come before. Where the Type Fixer submarine had been a modified version of designs conceived in the 1930s, the Type 21 was engineered for the underwater war that had actually emerged. Its hull was larger, stronger, and more streamlined. Its diesel engines were more powerful, but most crucially, it was equipped with a snorkel, a breathing tube that allowed the submarine to run its diesel engines while submerged, drawing air from above the surface and expelling exhaust gases. This single innovation promised to reduce the time the boat needed to spend on the surface, theoretically allowing it to remain submerged and invisible for far longer periods. The snorkel had been experimented with on earlier boats, but the Type 21 was the first design built from the ground up with this capability fully integrated. Furthermore, the Type 21's underwater speed was extraordinary for its time, approximately 17.5 knots submerged, nearly double that of the older Type Viec boats. This meant that if a Type 21 boat were attacked by depth charges while submerged, it could maneuver at speeds that earlier submarines could only achieve while on the surface. In theory, the balance of power in the Atlantic could shift again. In theory. The challenge was that theory and production were separated by an enormous gap. Building a Type 21 was far more complex than building a Type Viec. The welding requirements were more exacting. The materials needed were scarcer as Allied bombing destroyed German industry. The coordination between multiple shipyards was far more demanding. The German naval authorities attempted to establish a production assembly line system, breaking the construction of Type 21 boats into modular sections that could be built in different locations and then assembled together. It was an ambitious plan, one that showed how desperate German military leadership had become. Instead of the meticulous craft-building traditions of the shipyards, boats would be assembled almost like automobiles. The first Type 21 was launched in April of 1944. By the end of the war in May of 1945, Only two had actually entered operational service, two boats. After nearly 5 years of submarine warfare, with hundreds of earlier boats constructed and deployed, the Germans managed to get exactly two Type 21 submarines into combat before Germany's unconditional surrender. Neither achieved anything of military significance. Alongside the Type 21 came its smaller counterpart, the Type 23. If the Type 21 was designed for long-range oceanic patrols, the Type 23 was intended for shorter-range operations in coastal and shelf waters. At approximately 110 feet in length, compared to the Type 21's 111 feet, the distinction was minimal, but the Type 23's engineers optimized the design for shallow water operations and quick reaction sorties. Like the Type 21, it carried a snorkel and possessed underwater speed capabilities that far exceeded anything the Allies had encountered in the mid-war years. The Type 23 was intended to be produced in even greater numbers than the Type 21, with designs calling for more than 100 boats to be constructed. In reality, fewer than 5 were completed before the war ended, and none achieved any meaningful success in combat. Saint-Nazaire was designated as one of the bases where these new boats would operate once they became available in quantity. The dock facilities were expanded, the workshops were prepared, the crews were selected and trained, and then the boats simply did not arrive. The promises from the shipyards turned into excuses. The production schedules that had seemed so optimistic in 1944 became obvious fantasies. By late 1944, by early 1945, it was evident to everyone at the base that these revolutionary submarines would not save Germany. The reasons for this catastrophic failure were straightforward, if sobering. German shipbuilding capacity was being systematically destroyed by Allied bombing. The aircraft factories that produced the aircraft that would protect the shipyards were themselves the primary targets of Allied bombing campaigns. The raw materials that Germany had once extracted from across occupied Europe were now becoming scarce as German territory contracted and military logistics collapsed. The skilled workforce required for submarine construction was being conscripted into the Wehrmacht to fill gaps created by the losses at Stalingrad, Kursk, North Africa, and now the beaches of Normandy. And perhaps most fundamentally, the German government continued to pursue a vast array of military projects simultaneously. New tank designs, new jet aircraft, new radar systems, new weapons of every conceivable type. There was simply not enough industrial capacity in the Third Reich to build the Type 21 boats in the quantities that would have been required to make a genuine difference in the Atlantic War. The revolution would have needed to happen years earlier, when German industrial capacity was greater and when Germany still possessed the time to train crews and coordinate fleet operations. By 1943 and 1944, it was already far too late. Yet the German Navy pushed forward anyway, driven by a combination of professional pride and desperate hope. Admiral Dönitz, the commander of the German submarine service, and later Adolf Hitler's designated successor, had always believed that submarines were the key to German victory. In a way, he was correct. Had Germany possessed enough submarines with sufficient speed and endurance, the cumulative losses inflicted on Allied shipping might have exceeded the capacity of American shipyards to replace them. But that had been possible only in the 1938 to 1940 period, before American industrial might had fully mobilized, and before British and American anti-submarine tactics had matured. By 1944, Dönitz was attempting to correct the mistakes of 1940, mistakes that had seemed like victories at the time. He ordered the conversion of existing Type Physik boats to carry snorkels. Some of these modified boats did arrive at Saint-Nazaire in 1944 and 1945. They extended the operational capability of the older submarines, allowing them to spend somewhat more time underwater. But they were not revolutionary. They made the older boats marginally less vulnerable, which meant instead of being hunted to extinction in 3 or 4 years, the attrition might extend to 4 or 5 years. It was mathematics that offered no comfort. The experimental boats that did arrive at Saint-Nazaire in the final year of the war were treated almost as curiosities by the base's personnel. The Type 23 boats, when they appeared, were observed with a mixture of professional interest and grim realism. Yes, they were faster. Yes, they were equipped with new breathing apparatus. Yes, they could remain submerged for extended periods. But they were arriving into a war that was already lost. The Allies had air superiority over the Atlantic that had become absolute. The convoy systems had been refined to the point where a U-boat would be detected and attacked within hours of attacking a merchant vessel. The shipyards that had produced these boats were being destroyed even as the boats were being launched. The fuel oil that powered them was becoming scarce. The crews were increasingly young and inexperienced, conscripted from the Hitler Youth or drafted from combat units with no submarine training. One commanding officer at Saint-Nazaire noted in his war diary that the new boats were like giving a swordsman a better sword at the moment when firearms had already made swords obsolete. The Type 21 and Type 10 submarines represented the peak of German submarine design. If they had been available in 1941, they might have changed the course of the war. If they had been produced in the hundreds, if they had been manned by experienced crews, if they had been supported by surface vessels and air cover, if the German Navy had possessed the strategic initiative, rather than being entirely on the defensive, they might have posed a genuine threat to Allied operations. But none of those conditions existed by 1944. Instead, they were monuments to technological achievement, arriving decades too late. Proof that innovation alone cannot overcome the fundamental realities of industrial capacity, time, and strategic position. They were experiments conducted in desperation, solutions seeking problems that had already been definitively resolved in favor of the Allies. The engineers and designers who created them deserved credit for their ingenuity and technical brilliance. But no amount of technical brilliance could compensate for the wholesale mobilization of American industrial capacity, the proven effectiveness of Allied anti-submarine tactics, or the simple fact that Germany was losing the war on every front simultaneously. Saint-Nazaire became an observation point for these final technological experiments. The base's engineers examined the new boats. The crews trained on their systems. Intelligence was forwarded to higher headquarters about their capabilities and limitations. But there was no exhilaration in these activities, no sense that a corner had been turned or that hope had been restored. Instead, there was a grim awareness that these boats represented the last echo of German technological achievement. The base itself, once a symbol of German naval power, was becoming increasingly isolated. By late 1944, the Allies had landed in Normandy and were advancing across France. Saint-Nazaire, deep in Brittany on the Atlantic coast, was being cut off from the rest of German-occupied Europe. The new submarines, revolutionary as they might be in their design, would have nowhere to operate effectively. The Atlantic was no longer a battlefield where a revolutionary new submarine could turn the tide. It had become a hunting ground where even the most advanced German boat would face the same inexorable attrition that had claimed hundreds of earlier submarines. The dream of technological salvation, which had burned so brightly in the minds of German naval planners, was burning out like a match in the wind. The human cost of these final experimental deployments was measured not in the revolutionary new boats, there were simply too few of them, but in the thousands of sailors who continued to serve on the older now almost completely outmatched Type VX submarines. These men were sent to sea knowing, with a clarity that would have been unimaginable in 1941, that their chances of returning home were minimal. The casualty rates among German submarine crews reached levels that were almost suicidal by the final years of the war. Out of approximately 40,000 German submariners who served during the entire conflict, nearly 30,000 were killed. The percentage of personnel lost was among the highest of any branch of the German military. These were young men, many of them volunteers, who had joined the submarine service in the heady days when German U-boats seemed invincible. By 1944, they were being sent on patrols that offered little hope of success and almost guaranteed death. The new Type 21 and Type Tanai boats offered them no salvation. There were too few of them, and they arrived far too late. At Saint-Nazaire specifically, the arrival of these experimental boats represented something beyond mere technical development. They were admissions of failure. If the Type VX submarine had been adequate, there would have been no need for revolutionary new designs. If German strategy in the early years of the war had been correct, there would have been no need to undertake crash programs to construct entirely new classes of submarines. The very existence of the Type 21 and Type Fu-3 RAS represented a confession that the decisions made in 1940 and 1941 had been wrong, that the rate of U-boat construction had been inadequate, that the strategic gamble of submarine commerce raiding had failed. German military leadership could not admit these things openly. Instead, they promoted the new boats as proof that German technological superiority would yet triumph. They published propaganda materials showing the sleek lines of the Type 21 and promising victory. But the men who actually operated these submarines, the officers and engineers at bases like Saint-Nazaire, understood the terrible reality beneath the propaganda. These boats were not harbingers of a German comeback. They were the final, desperate attempt to squeeze victory from a war that had already been lost. The contrast between expectation and reality grew sharper as 1945 approached. The German High Command spoke of deploying entire fleets of Type 21 and Type 23 submarines that would sweep Allied convoys from the Atlantic and force Britain to surrender through starvation. The reality was that a handful of boats, perhaps a dozen at most, would actually enter service before Germany's unconditional surrender. Of these, most would be sunk by Allied forces without achieving anything of military significance. One Type 21 boat, the U-3393, would surrender to the Allies in May of 1945 without ever having fired a torpedo in anger. Another would be scuttled by its own crew, rather than allow it to fall into Allied hands. The revolution in submarine design, which might have changed everything if it had come 5 years earlier, arrived only as an epitaph. It was a reminder that in industrial warfare, timing is often more important than innovation. A technically superior weapon, arriving after the enemy has already secured overwhelming superiority in all other respects, is no weapon at all. At Saint-Nazaire, as the base prepared to receive and operate these advanced boats, the men who worked there understood this bitter equation with a clarity that no amount of official propaganda could obscure. They understood that they were at the end of something, not the beginning. The age of the Atlantic U-boat was over. The age of German naval supremacy had ended years before. All that remained was the difficult work of endurance, holding on to Saint-Nazaire for as long as possible, operating whatever submarines could still be sent to sea, and watching as the inevitable approach of Allied forces turned the fortress on the Loire into a last bastion of a defeated nation. By the start of 1944, the Atlantic War had fundamentally transformed. The U-boats that once hunted merchant convoys with impunity now found themselves pursued with equal ferocity. Saint-Nazaire, the fortress that had sheltered German submarines through years of strategic success, was no longer a base of operations. It had become a target. The Allies understood what German planners had known for 2 years. This port on the Loire estuary was irreplaceable to Nazi naval strategy. Destroy it, and the Atlantic campaign would collapse entirely. The concrete bunkers that had seemed impenetrable when constructed now stood as monuments to a fading empire, and the sky above them was no longer empty. The bombing intensified as spring turned to summer in 1944. The Royal Air Force brought waves of Lancaster bombers, Mosquitoes, and Halifaxes in coordinated assaults that turned the port into a world of flame and debris. Each raid lasted hours. The defenders fired back with flak batteries positioned around the perimeter, their shells tracing arcs of light against the darkness. But the sheer volume of aircraft made defense almost theatrical in its futility. The concrete U-boat pens, those massive structures with roofs up to 10 meters thick, could shelter the submarines themselves, but everything else lay exposed to the bombardment. The docks crumbled. The repair shops were reduced to smoking rubble. The accommodation blocks where the crews had slept were obliterated. The port's infrastructure, so carefully constructed over 4 years, was being unmade in weeks. For the workers at Saint-Nazaire, the bombing was catastrophic. Thousands of French laborers had been brought to the base as conscripted workers, building and maintaining the facilities. When the bombers came, most of them could seek shelter only in hastily prepared trenches or cellars. The German authorities prioritized bunkers for military personnel and the U-boat crews themselves. The French workers died by the hundreds. Some fell during direct hits on their work areas. Others perished when accommodation blocks collapsed during night raids. The port town of Saint-Nazaire itself, the civilian population that had existed there before the occupation, was shattered. Entire neighborhoods were flattened. Families who had remained through 4 years of occupation were wiped out in hours. The Germans counted the casualties with cold precision, but they never stopped the bombing, because stopping it was impossible. The Allies controlled the air, and the air meant everything. The strategic situation shifted with the invasion of Normandy on the 6th of June 1944. Suddenly, Saint-Nazaire was not merely under siege from the air, it was being cut off from the rest of occupied Europe. The German supply lines that fed the base with fuel, ammunition, and spare parts stretched across France, and those lines were being systematically destroyed. The Allies were advancing inland from the beaches with unstoppable momentum. Within weeks, German forces across Brittany were falling back or being encircled. Saint-Nazaire, situated on the coast with the Atlantic to its rear, found itself increasingly isolated. The base commander understood what was coming: entrapment. The fortress would become a pocket, a German garrison surrounded by enemies with nowhere to retreat. The fuel situation became critical by summer 1944. Submarines require vast quantities of diesel oil to function. The U-boats that operated from Saint-Nazaire consumed fuel at a rate measured in thousands of tons per month. Supply convoys that once brought fuel from the Reich could no longer reach the base. German tankers, attempting to transit the Bay of Biscay, were sunk by increasing numbers of Allied aircraft and patrol vessels. By late summer, the fuel reserves at Saint-Nazaire had dwindled to a fraction of what was needed to sustain even minimal operations. The few U-boats still at the base were immobilized, rendered useless not by enemy action, but by the simple fact that they had no fuel to move. Some were scuttled deliberately to prevent their capture. Others sat in the pens, their hulls intact, but their crews transferred to shore-based defensive roles. The submarine base was becoming a submarine graveyard. The transformation into a land fortress accelerated as 1944 progressed toward winter. The base commander reinforced the garrison with additional German soldiers withdrawn from other positions in France. Concrete anti-tank obstacles were laid around the perimeter. Machine gun positions were established in the remaining buildings and fortifications. The German troops prepared for a siege with the kind of methodical precision that German military culture demanded, even when the cause was clearly lost. Every soldier understood that Germany itself was now under direct threat. Russian forces were advancing from the east. American and British forces were advancing from the west and north. The war that had once seemed infinite, endless in its expansion, was now closing in. Saint-Nazaire would hold or be overrun, but either way, the end was approaching. The bombing continued without mercy through autumn and winter 1944. The Allies had no reason to spare the base now that it was cut off from reinforcement. Every bomb dropped on Saint-Nazaire was a bomb that would not need to be dropped elsewhere. The port became a shooting gallery, and the Allies controlled the guns. The RAF sent bombers in daylight and darkness, in good weather and fog, in formations so large that the German flak batteries could not possibly intercept them all. The concrete bunkers still served their purpose. The submarines that remained were protected, but the base itself, the supporting infrastructure, the human elements that made it function, were steadily dismantled. Water became scarce because the infrastructure supplying it was destroyed. Food supplies ran low because the warehouses were leveled. Medicine was scarce. The garrison was increasingly isolated, even from the rest of Nazi Germany, communications degrading as telephone lines and radio equipment were destroyed in the bombing. The human cost of the bombing campaign around Saint-Nazaire was staggering. French civilians, who remained in the area, were dying alongside German soldiers. The distinction between military and civilian targets had become blurred in the practical reality of sustained bombing. The port town itself was essentially uninhabitable by late 1944. The German authorities moved whatever civilian population remained away from the immediate vicinity of the base, but there was nowhere safe to move to. Allied aircraft controlled the skies across all of occupied France. Refugee camps and hastily established temporary settlements were themselves targets of bombing or subject to attack by Allied ground forces as the front advanced. The war had come home to the French coast in its most total and destructive form. The people who suffered most were those caught between the retreating German forces and the advancing Allies, unable to escape in either direction. The strategic meaninglessness of holding Saint-Nazaire became increasingly obvious as 1944 turned into 1945. The U-boat arm itself was collapsing. Boats that attempted to put to sea from Saint-Nazaire faced superior numbers of Allied escort vessels, improved detection technology, and coordinated air support. The losses were catastrophic. New U-boats reaching completion in German shipyards could not be delivered to operational commands because the sea routes were too dangerous. The handful of submarines that could still be operated from Saint-Nazaire were increasingly relegated to training missions or desperate one-way patrols that everybody understood would end in destruction. The base that had once been the headquarters of sustained Atlantic commerce raiding, the nerve center of a global submarine campaign, had become a monument to past ambitions. The crews still served there with discipline and professionalism, but they were defending not a vital strategic position, but a point of honor and a symbol of German refusal to surrender. Winter 1944 was brutal on the garrison. The bombardment continued. The isolation deepened. The German command structure at Saint-Nazaire was increasingly cut off from clear directives from Berlin. Hitler's orders to hold every position were absolute and non-negotiable, but the practical reality was that the position could not be held in any meaningful way. The base commander received contradictory instructions: hold the fortress and maximize damage to the enemy, but also prepare for evacuation or determined last-stand defense. The garrison was reduced to maintaining what infrastructure remained, caring for wounded, and preparing for whatever final phase of the war the next months might bring. Food rations were cut repeatedly. The medical facilities, severely damaged by bombing, were overwhelmed with casualties from the bombing itself. Morale among the troops was a complex mixture of determination, fatalism, and the knowledge that the war was being lost. They were soldiers, and soldiers followed orders, but the orders came from a regime that was increasingly detached from reality. The Allies, meanwhile, had made a strategic decision to contain, rather than assault Saint-Nazaire directly. The fortress was surrounded and isolated, its garrison trapped behind German defensive lines that were themselves collapsing. The Allies knew that the base would fall eventually, that its garrison would be forced to surrender or be overrun. A direct assault would be costly in Allied lives, and there was no strategic imperative to capture it immediately. Saint-Nazaire could be bypassed, left to wither, and eventually surrender as the war closed in around it. This containment strategy meant that the base remained under bombardment, but was not subjected to ground assault. The garrison lived in a strange limbo, defending a fortress that was no longer connected to anything larger, knowing that ultimate defeat was inevitable, but not knowing when or how it would come. As 1945 began, Saint-Nazaire was a devastated port, defended by increasingly depleted German forces, cut off from all supply and reinforcement. The U-boat pens still stood, those immense concrete structures that had proven their ability to protect submarines from bombing, but they contained only a handful of operational boats. Most of the base's personnel had been converted to shore-based defense roles, or pressed into labor to clear rubble and maintain the fortress. The living conditions were deteriorating rapidly. Winter cold, limited heating fuel, inadequate food, and the constant threat of bombing created a situation of mounting desperation. The German military administration at Saint-Nazaire continued to function with bureaucratic precision even as the larger structure of Nazi Germany disintegrated around them. Orders were received and executed, reports were filed, discipline was maintained. It was as if the routines of military command could somehow forestall the inevitable conclusion toward which everything was moving. The significance of Saint-Nazaire in 1945 was no longer strategic, it was symbolic. The fortress represented German determination to hold ground, to refuse surrender, to maintain military discipline and structure in the face of overwhelming defeat. That symbolism was important to the Nazi leadership, even as the practical military value of holding the base had become zero. Fuel supplies had effectively ceased. Ammunition for the flak batteries was being carefully rationed. The few remaining U-boats were too vulnerable to operate with any realistic chance of success. The base served no function, except as a symbol that Germany was not yet finished, that somewhere on the Atlantic coast of occupied France, German soldiers still held positions and defied the enemy. This was the reduced reality of Saint-Nazaire in its final year of war, a monument to persistence, a statement made in concrete and blood, a last outpost of a regime that was being systematically dismantled from every direction simultaneously. The summer of 1944 marked a turning point that no fortress, no matter how heavily armored, could ultimately withstand. On the 6th of June, Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, establishing the first permanent foothold in occupied France. Within days, hundreds of thousands of troops poured across the Channel, and the carefully constructed German defensive lines began to crumble under the weight of superior numbers, material, and tactical innovation. For Saint-Nazaire, lying roughly 200 kilometers south of the landing zones, the implications were swift and catastrophic. The port that had once served as Germany's gateway to Atlantic dominance now found itself rapidly transforming into an isolated garrison, cut off from supply lines, reinforcement, and any realistic hope of relief. What had been a strategic asset of immeasurable value to the Third Reich was becoming a trap, a fortified prison holding thousands of German sailors, soldiers, and support personnel who would soon have nowhere to go. The initial shock of the Normandy invasion sent tremors through German command structures across occupied France. High-ranking officers at Saint-Nazaire watched the reports filtering in from the beachheads with a mixture of alarm and disbelief. The defenses that they had painstakingly constructed over 4 years suddenly seemed irrelevant to the larger catastrophe unfolding to the north. Within weeks, the German armies in Normandy were in chaos. The breakthrough at Avranches in early August, followed by the encirclement and partial destruction of German forces in the Falaise pocket, shattered any illusion that a stable defensive line could be maintained in France. The German armies were fragmenting, retreating, and collapsing under relentless Allied pressure from both ground and air. Saint-Nazaire's isolation was no longer a theoretical possibility. It was becoming an inescapable reality. The base that once bustled with U-boats arriving and departing for Atlantic patrols now faced a future of increasing starvation and irrelevance. As the summer of 1944 wore on, the German commander at Saint-Nazaire, Admiral Ernst Schürlitz, faced an extraordinarily difficult situation with no good solutions. Schürlitz, a career naval officer who had overseen the port's operations for years, now had to confront the prospect of defending an isolated fortress with limited resources and no prospect of external support. The surrounding countryside, which had been firmly under German control for 4 years, was rapidly falling under Allied influence. French resistance cells, emboldened by the collapse of German military authority, began openly attacking German positions and infrastructure. Supply convoys attempting to reach the base were increasingly ambushed or forced to take dangerous detours. The railway lines that had once carried fuel, ammunition, and food to the port were now cut or controlled by hostile forces. Schürlitz made a critical decision. The base would be transformed into a fortress garrison, every structure fortified, every avenue of approach defended, as if preparing for a siege that everyone understood would eventually come. The German garrison at Saint-Nazaire began an intensive program of fortification in August and September of 1944. The massive concrete U-boat pens that had proven so effective against aerial bombardment were repurposed as strongpoints for infantry defense. Gun emplacements were positioned to cover the approaches to the port from all directions. Anti-tank obstacles were emplaced around the perimeter, and barbed wire entanglements were extended to create multiple defensive lines. The Germans had learned bitter lessons from years of warfare. Fortified positions could hold out for extended periods if properly supplied and commanded by determined officers. Yet even as they built these defenses, the stark reality became impossible to ignore. Supplies were finite, reinforcement would not come, and the enemy surrounding them was growing stronger with each passing day. The psychological burden on the garrison was immense. These men understood, in the manner that soldiers always understand when confronted with hopeless situations, that they were trapped. The bunkers that had once offered shelter from bombs now offered the only shelter available from a rapidly advancing enemy. The first weeks of September 1944 witnessed the final severance of Saint-Nazaire from the German-occupied territories to the east. The Loire River, which had always seemed like a natural defensive barrier, was now a line that could not be crossed. The few bridges across the river that remained under German control became increasingly vulnerable to air attack and sabotage. By mid-September, German forces had withdrawn beyond the Loire, leaving Saint-Nazaire completely isolated behind enemy lines. The base was now surrounded not by a formal Allied siege line. There was no need for such a thing, given Allied numerical superiority, but by a tightening noose of French forces, American units, and advancing British and Canadian formations. Supply by sea was impossible. Allied naval dominance made any attempt to provision the port by ship a suicide mission. Supply by air was theoretically possible, but practically negligible. German air resources were almost non-existent by this point, and the few transport aircraft that might have reached the base were desperately needed elsewhere. Saint-Nazaire was besieged without formal siege lines, starved without a blockade fleet, cut off without explicit military orders to that effect. The isolation was simply the natural result of military defeat. Within the fortress, daily life became an exercise in managed decline and stubborn resistance. The garrison comprised approximately 10,000 German personnel, sailors, soldiers, engineers, and support staff, along with several thousand French workers and civilians who had become trapped within the perimeter. Fresh water became increasingly scarce as the water supply lines were cut or damaged by bombardment. Food rations were reduced repeatedly as the stockpiles that had been accumulated in better times were consumed. Fuel for vehicles and heating grew desperately short as autumn turned to winter. The wounded accumulated in the fortress's medical facilities, with no possibility of evacuation or proper treatment. The death rate from disease, malnutrition, and untreated injuries climbed month by month. Yet the German commander and his officers maintained the fortress as a military installation, enforcing discipline, maintaining fighting strength, and refusing any suggestion of surrender. This was partly military convention. German officers had been trained to hold their positions to the last man, but it was also partly defiance, a refusal to accept that the 1,000-year Reich that Hitler had promised was collapsing into ruin. The bombardment of Saint-Nazaire continued intermittently throughout the autumn and winter of 1944. The Royal Air Force, having realized that direct bombing of the U-boat pens was largely futile, focused instead on destroying the surrounding infrastructure that sustained the garrison. The town of Saint-Nazaire itself, which had already suffered terribly during the earlier bombing campaigns, was reduced further to rubble. The docks, the warehouses, the repair facilities, the fuel storage tanks, all of these were systematically destroyed or rendered inoperable. Yet paradoxically, the destruction of the town made the garrison's isolation more absolute. As the surrounding buildings were flattened, the fortress became more insular, more cut off from the civilian population that might have provided information or support. The concrete bunkers that sheltered the U-boats proved equally valuable in protecting German troops from air attack. The combination of concrete bunkers and defensive positions made frontal assault against the fortress prohibitively expensive in terms of Allied casualties. So the Allies, reasoning correctly that they did not need to take the fortress through military action, simply contained it and waited. They had limitless time, superior resources, and the knowledge that the German military machine was collapsing across all fronts. Saint-Nazaire could be left to wither on the vine. The psychological impact of isolation on the garrison cannot be overstated. Cut off from news other than official German sources, uncertain about what was happening in Germany itself, watching their nation collapse day by day, the men of Saint-Nazaire endured mounting desperation. Some attempted to escape, slipping through the lines at night, or trying to hide among the civilian population. The German command responded to desertion with harsh discipline, executing some deserters as examples to the rest. Others simply waited, preserving their strength, hoping against hope that some miracle would reverse the catastrophic tide of war. Letters and messages, sent from the fortress, make clear the state of mind that gripped the garrison. They speak of isolation, of abandonment, of fighting for reasons that no longer seem to make sense. These were not volunteers in a righteous cause. They were conscripted soldiers and sailors, trapped in a concrete fortress, watching their nation die, with no possibility of escape and no purpose that justified their continued suffering. The fortress that had once been a symbol of German power and technological achievement had become a symbol of something very different: the futility of military resistance when the underlying cause was already lost. Supply drops by German aircraft became increasingly rare and insufficient. By winter of 1944, the Luftwaffe was barely functional, focused entirely on home defense against the massive bombing campaign against German industry and cities. Any aircraft that might have reached Saint-Nazaire was needed elsewhere, and the quantities that could be delivered were negligible compared to the needs of 10,000 men. The garrison began slaughtering horses and other animals to supplement food rations. The medical situation deteriorated sharply as disease spread through the overcrowded barracks. Dysentery, tuberculosis, and other illnesses that thrived in conditions of poor nutrition and close quarters began to claim lives with increasing frequency. The fortress's hospital facilities, already inadequate, were overwhelmed. Wounded men who might have been evacuated and treated in previous years now had no option but to remain in the fortress and hope that their injuries did not become infected or gangrenous. The engineering corps that had built the fortress did not have the resources to maintain it properly. Concrete bunkers that had once been considered permanent fortifications began to show cracks and water damage from weathering and bombardment. The surrounding defenses, hastily constructed in the autumn, were deteriorating rapidly. The arrival of winter brought new torments to the garrison. The Atlantic coast is cold and wet in winter, with persistent rain and occasional snow. The fortress had been designed for a different purpose. It was meant to be a U-boat base, with relatively comfortable berthing and facilities for naval personnel. It was not designed as a garrison fortress for thousands of soldiers. The barracks were inadequate, the heating systems were failing, as fuel supplies dwindled, and the water systems were frequently frozen or damaged. Frostbite and hypothermia became common, especially among men who spent long hours on watch in the defensive positions around the perimeter. The morale of the garrison, despite the best efforts of German officers and propaganda, was approaching the breaking point. The men understood that they were trapped in an isolated fortress, defending a position that had no strategic value in a war that was already lost. They watched the sky for signs that the Luftwaffe might somehow return. They listened to rumors of wonder weapons that might reverse the situation. But the reality, which every man could see with his own eyes, was that they were being forgotten by their own command structure, abandoned in a concrete prison, waiting for a war that had already been decided elsewhere to finally reach them. Radio communications with German command became increasingly sporadic and unhelpful as 1944 turned into 1945. The messages that did reach Saint-Nazaire from Berlin were often contradictory or delusional, offering directives that were impossible to follow or based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the military situation. Admiral Schirlitz, the German commander, maintained discipline and kept the fortress operational, but he was navigating a situation that had no precedent and no good solution. He could not evacuate the garrison. There was nowhere to evacuate to, and the Allies controlled all the exits. He could not receive meaningful reinforcement. German forces everywhere were in retreat or pinned down. He could not improve supply. The routes were all cut. What he could do was maintain military order, prevent the fortress from falling into chaos, and hope that either the war would end or some unexpected reversal would change the situation. That was a thin hope by any reasonable measure, but it was the only hope available to him. So the German garrison, condemned to isolation and increasingly aware of their abandonment, settled in to endure a siege that was more psychological than military, a grinding test of will between a fortress garrison and the knowledge that their war was already lost, but their personal ordeal was not yet finished. The contrast between Saint-Nazaire and the larger collapse of German military power could not have been sharper. To the north and east, German armies were fragmenting, retreating, fighting desperate rearguard actions against overwhelming Allied forces that had broken through into Belgium and were driving toward the Rhine. In the east, Soviet armies were advancing relentlessly toward Germany itself, after liberating Poland and overwhelming German forces from the Vistula to the Oder River. German cities were being leveled in massive bombing raids that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians and shattered the industrial base that sustained the German war machine. It was clear to anyone with eyes to see that Germany had lost the war, that defeat was inevitable, and that the only questions remaining were how long the agony would continue and what the peace would look like when it finally came. Yet at Saint-Nazaire, a small garrison of 10,000 men continued to man their positions, maintain their defenses, and follow orders to hold the fortress at all costs. They were a tiny fragment of a dying nation, cut off from the main disaster, living in their own isolated pocket of resistance that had become meaningless but could not be stopped because the momentum of military discipline and the inertia of orders continued to drive them forward. The fortress garrison passed the winter and approached the spring of 1945 in a state of diminishing capability but undiminished defiance. The men were hungry, cold, tired, and increasingly convinced that they were being sacrificed for no purpose. But they held their positions nonetheless. A few U-boats still operated from the base, conducting patrols that had almost no chance of success given Allied naval dominance. But that continued anyway, because orders said they should. The German command structure at Saint-Nazaire remained in place. The flag still flew from the fortress, and the fortress garrison continued to exist as a military unit, even though it was now anachronistic, irrelevant, and utterly surrounded. The Allies, meanwhile, simply contained the fortress and waited for the final collapse of German resistance elsewhere to reach its inevitable conclusion. There was no need to take Saint-Nazaire by storm, no need to assault its concrete bunkers, no need to spend Allied lives in a frontal assault on fortified positions when time and starvation were doing the work for them. So the fortress endured, defiant but hopeless, surrounded but unbowed, a small island of German military power in an ocean of defeat that was rising higher with each passing week. The stage was being set for the final act. By the autumn of 1944, the strategic map of Western Europe had been redrawn entirely. The Normandy landings in June had shattered German hopes of containing an American and British invasion to a narrow beachhead. Within weeks, the breakout from Normandy had accelerated into a full-scale advance eastward, with Allied armoured columns racing toward Paris, then beyond toward the German border itself. Yet Saint-Nazaire, that fortress of concrete and steel on the Loire estuary, did not fall. It was not stormed. It was not surrounded in the traditional sense. Instead, it was simply left behind, cut off, isolated, but deliberately maintained as a functioning German garrison by Berlin's explicit orders. This decision would transform the U-boat base from a strategic asset into something far more unusual, a symbol of German military stubbornness, a pocket of Nazi control that would endure for 8 additional months while the Greater Reich collapsed around it. The strategic purpose of holding Saint-Nazaire had evaporated entirely. The port could no longer serve as an operational base for Atlantic commerce raiding. Allied naval power had made that impossible for over a year. The U-boats that occasionally departed from the estuary were few in number, their patrols brief, their success negligible. The base consumed resources, manpower, and supplies that Germany desperately needed elsewhere. Yet Hitler and his senior commanders refused to abandon it. This refusal was rooted not in rational calculation, but in ideology and obstinacy. German military doctrine had always emphasized fortress defense, the notion that fortified positions must be held to the last man, regardless of strategic circumstance. Saint-Nazaire's massive concrete bunkers, its proven resistance to bombing, and its symbolic importance as Hitler's first major Atlantic fortress, made it a test case for this doctrine. Surrendering it without a decisive battle would be politically unthinkable to the Nazi leadership. The base had cost billions of Reichsmarks to construct. Its bunkers were engineering marvels by the standards of the age. To abandon such a position voluntarily would signal weakness, admit strategic failure, and contradict everything the Nazi regime had proclaimed about German invulnerability. Thus the decision was made at the highest levels. Saint-Nazaire would be held as long as humanly possible. The garrison would be reinforced with additional troops. Supply lines would be maintained by whatever means the German Navy could muster. The base would become, in effect, a fortress enclave, a piece of territory that Hitler would cling to like a drowning man grasping at flotsam. This decision had immediate consequences for everyone at Saint-Nazaire, both soldiers and civilians. The base transitioned from an operational military installation into a siege garrison, preparing for inevitable confrontation with overwhelming Allied force. By autumn of 1944, the German commander at Saint-Nazaire was Vice Admiral Wilhelm Schiemann, a career naval officer who had served in the First World War and risen through the ranks during the Nazi period. Schiemann faced an unprecedented challenge: defend an isolated fortress that was not under active assault but was cut off from German-controlled territory, with no possibility of relief from outside forces. The Allies had established a perimeter around the base, but it was loose and porous initially. German forces could still conduct limited supply operations along the coast or via the Loire River, though these became increasingly dangerous as autumn turned to winter. The German garrison, which would eventually number between 6,000 and 8,000 troops, consisted of naval personnel, Luftwaffe elements, army units, and a variety of support personnel. These soldiers faced the peculiar psychology of a besieged garrison in a war that was being lost. They knew that Germany was collapsing. They could see it in the maps of territorial losses, hear it in the radio broadcasts, sense it in the increasingly desperate nature of military communications. Yet they were ordered to hold Saint-Nazaire as though ultimate victory remained possible. This cognitive dissonance, the gap between what they could observe and what they were told to believe, created an atmosphere of surreal resignation within the base. The U-boat operations that continued from Saint-Nazaire during this period were increasingly futile gestures rather than strategic endeavors. The second submarine flotilla, which had once coordinated wolf-pack attacks involving dozens of boats, now sent out individual submarines on patrols that rarely lasted more than a few weeks. These boats were manned by experienced crews, but they operated in an ocean that had become fundamentally hostile to their existence. Allied escort vessels were now equipped with advanced radar, sonar, and homing torpedo weapons that the U-boats had no effective defense against. The appearance of Allied escort carriers meant that even distant convoys now had air protection. Depth charge attacks had become far more effective through years of accumulated experience by anti-submarine specialists. Worse still, German U-boats now had to contend with schnorkel technology, breathing apparatus that allowed diesel engines to run while submerged, which was itself a confession of desperation. The schnorkel was fragile, prone to damage, and vulnerable to damage from depth charges. The Type Texter 1 and Type Tex NC experimental submarines that had been promised as revolutionary weapons either never arrived at Saint-Nazaire or arrived in such small numbers that they made no strategic difference. The last U-boats to operate from Saint-Nazaire conducted patrols not because they were likely to succeed, but because the German Navy insisted on maintaining the appearance of active submarine warfare until the very end. The concrete bunkers that had proven so effective against air bombardment became, paradoxically, a liability for a trapped garrison. They were wonderfully protective against bombs, but they made Saint-Nazaire itself more valuable to hold and more costly to finally capture. The Allies could have bypassed the base entirely, moving their armies elsewhere, leaving the Germans to slowly starve. But the bunker's continued existence meant that French territory remained partially under Nazi control, that the German flag still flew over a significant port facility. The political and symbolic cost of this was substantial for the Free French forces under Charles de Gaulle, who wanted to demonstrate that French territory could be liberated through French military action. The United States and Britain, allied with de Gaulle, permitted him to assign French forces to contain Saint-Nazaire, while the main Allied armies pressed eastward into Germany itself. French units gradually tightened the cordon around the base throughout late 1944 and early 1945. The siege was not a dramatic encirclement, but rather a slow strangulation. French patrols cutting off escape routes, making supply runs increasingly perilous, and ensuring that German forces were contained and immobilized. Within Saint-Nazaire itself, conditions deteriorated steadily as winter arrived. The port facilities had been devastated by months of bombing. The U-boat pens and bunkers remained intact, but nearly everything else had been damaged or destroyed. The barracks were damaged. The supply warehouses had been burned or demolished. The repair facilities that had once maintained and refitted submarines were partially functional at best. Fresh water became scarce, as the infrastructure that supplied it was damaged. Food supplies, brought in sporadically by German vessels or via the Loire, were never adequate. The German garrison had to maintain strict rationing. Coal for heating became so scarce that soldiers suffered through the winter in partially heated barracks. Morale, as might be expected, suffered considerably. These were not fanatics willing to die for the Nazi cause. Many were older soldiers, conscripts, or men who had already served long years in the military. They understood that Germany was losing. They comprehended that holding Saint-Nazaire served no military purpose. Yet they remained at their posts, maintained their discipline, and continued to follow orders, because that is what professional soldiers do, even when those orders make no rational sense. The French civilian population in and around Saint-Nazaire endured perhaps the worst conditions of all. During the occupation, the Germans had required local labor for construction and maintenance of the base. Some French workers had collaborated, seeing it as employment and survival. Others had been conscripted or coerced. When the Allies liberated the rest of France, Saint-Nazaire remained under German control, and the civilian population found itself living in a garrison town under siege, caught between two military forces. The bombardments had caused massive damage to the town itself. Thousands of civilians had been killed in the air raids. Survivors lived in damaged buildings, with inadequate food supplies, no electricity or gas in most areas, and the ever-present danger that fighting might break out at any moment. Some civilians had fled the area when possible. Others remained, either unable to leave or hoping that staying in place was safer than attempting to cross battle lines. The Red Cross and other neutral organizations made occasional efforts to assist the population, but their ability to operate was severely limited. The town of Saint-Nazaire became a ghost of itself, a place of rubble, hunger, and waiting, where the war had stopped moving forward but had not yet definitively ended. The German command at Saint-Nazaire remained aware that surrender would eventually be necessary, but pride and Nazi ideology prevented any voluntary capitulation. Admiral Schliemann and his superiors maintained the fiction that the base would be held indefinitely, that somehow German power would be restored, that relief from other German forces might still be possible. These were not delusions held by ignorant men, but rather a necessary pretense maintained by officers who understood the realities but had no choice but to obey their political masters. The Nazis had established a culture in which public acknowledgement of defeat was regarded as defeatism and could result in execution. Officers who suggested withdrawal or suggested the obvious, that Germany was losing and that surrendering now would save lives, could find themselves court-martialed or worse. Thus, the chain of command at Saint-Nazaire maintained the official position that resistance would continue indefinitely, even as the individual officers almost surely knew this was impossible. Communication with Berlin became increasingly sporadic and eventually ceased entirely as German command and control infrastructure collapsed. Admiral Schliemann, in the final weeks, was receiving orders that made no military sense and that contradicted other orders received just days earlier. He was operating, in effect, as an autonomous commander of an isolated garrison with no real contact with the larger German military structure. The final U-boat operations from Saint-Nazaire during the winter of 1944 and early 1945 represented a kind of military theater that served no purpose except to maintain the appearance of continuous warfare. Individual submarines would depart on patrol, sometimes successfully sinking merchant vessels or even attacking Allied warships, but the overall impact on the war was absolutely negligible. Germany's naval power in the Atlantic had been comprehensively defeated. The U-boat arm, which had once terrified Allied shipping and come perilously close to strangling Britain through commerce raiding, had become a force that could do nothing but endure its own extinction. The U-boats operating from Saint-Nazaire in early 1945 had the highest probability of loss of any German military units in existence. Many crews understood that they were being sent out on patrols from which they were unlikely to return. Yet they went, because refusing an order was mutiny, because German military culture still demanded obedience, and because some small hope remained that one final miracle might reverse the strategic situation. None of these patrols changed anything. They did not damage Allied supply lines significantly. They did not slow the Allied advance into Germany. They did not delay the inevitable conclusion of the war. They were simply the final gasps of a military organization that refused to acknowledge that it had already been defeated. The isolation of Saint-Nazaire became progressively more complete as 1945 began. The Germans could still send supply vessels to the base, but these were increasingly sunk or turned back by French naval forces and air force units that now had complete dominance in the region. The base's situation was analogous to that of other German pockets that had been cut off by the rapid Allied advance. Places like Dunkirk, other channel ports, and fortress garrisons in Eastern Europe. All of these places were being held according to the same doctrine. Fortifications must be defended to the last man. Surrender is not an option, and the mere existence of German soldiers in these garrisons was somehow a strategic asset, despite the complete absence of any strategic rationale for holding them. Saint-Nazaire's garrison watched as German forces elsewhere capitulated, as neighboring ports fell to Allied assault, as the front lines shifted further and further away. The psychological effect on the troops was profound. They had become spectators to their own military's catastrophe. They could do nothing except maintain their positions and wait for whatever would come next. Discipline held, but only barely. Desertion increased toward the end, though the numbers were limited because escape from Saint-Nazaire was extraordinarily difficult. A soldier attempting to flee faced either recapture by German patrols or capture by French forces, neither of which was a desirable outcome. By April 1945, with Germany collapsing entirely and Soviet forces closing in on Berlin itself, Saint-Nazaire remained under German control, largely because no one could figure out how to end the situation without violence. The French forces containing the base had received orders not to attack unless the Germans showed aggressive intent. The Germans, despite their isolated position, still possessed sufficient firepower to make an assault costly. Both sides preferred to wait. This waiting game continued right up to the moment of Germany's final surrender. In the final days of the war, Admiral Schliemann received notification that Berlin had capitulated unconditionally, that Hitler was dead, that all German forces were ordered to cease resistance and surrender to the nearest Allied commander. Even at this final moment, the Nazi regime's obsession with protocol was evident. Formal orders for surrender were issued through proper military channels, as though the meticulous documentation of defeat could somehow preserve German military honor. At Saint-Nazaire, the transition from war to surrender occurred almost without incident. French forces moved into the base and formally took control. The German garrison, after months of isolation and the knowledge that Germany had been utterly defeated, offered no resistance. They laid down their weapons, removed their insignia, and became prisoners of war. The bunkers that had been built to withstand bombing and invasion were surrendered without a shot being fired. The base that Hitler had ordered, held to the last man, was given up quietly, almost apologetically, by an officer corps that had never questioned their ultimate orders, even when those orders had become completely senseless. The endurance of Saint-Nazaire as a German fortress pocket in the final months of the war stands as a particular kind of historical emblem. It represents neither triumph nor tragedy in the conventional sense, but rather the stubborn persistence of military organization and discipline, even when that organization has become fundamentally disconnected from any rational strategic purpose. The soldiers at Saint-Nazaire, German sailors, soldiers, and airmen, together with the French civilians trapped in the garrison, endured months of isolation, deprivation, and psychological stress, because military culture and Nazi ideology demanded it. No one at Saint-Nazaire in 1945 harbored any serious hope that Germany could still win the war. Yet the base was held. U-boats still patrolled. By the opening months of